Okay, so we're not muted. We will share our screen. And
What's that?
Oh,
Well, I've been acting as my own check first. Human. An exploration of the factors, in the context of an urban park visitors and wildlife.
you should be able to, but if that doesn't work.
All y'all get the concept, be watching for the numbers. I am known to hook people, so.
There we go.
Great. Hi, and thank you for coming. My name is Cheryl Hirsch. I'm a PhD candidate at UW-Madison, and it didn't take me this long to get to this point. I decided to go back to school after I finished my master's program a very long time ago. I started the PhD program and decided, you know what, I need to go back and finish that. So I want to mention the two collaborators on this study, Elizabeth Perry from Michigan State University and David Drake from UW-Madison. Let's see if this works. No. Yeah. There we go. As I was putting together the material for this presentation, I really wanted to come up with a simple definition of human nature connection, something to offset the more formal definition, which typically reads the conceptualization of an individual's identification with the natural world. That definition doesn't lend a lot of clarity. So I decided the easiest way to define human nature connection for you was to tell you a little bit about how it is studied. Human nature connection is studied in two main ways. One is to look at the factors involved in the development and enhancement of human nature connection. And the other way is to look at it as a predictive tool for health assessment and pro-environmental behavior. Both areas of study are thought to be essential to environmental sustainability, meaning if we can figure out what the key factors are that go into the development of human nature connection, we can use that to increase pro-environmental behavior and thereby establish a very strong pathway toward environmental sustainability. The area of studies on the right side of the screen are more common. The areas of study on the left side is a growing area of research, and that's the type of research I'm going to talk to you about today. So how is human nature connection measured? There are many tools for measuring human nature connection. They are administered by way of survey. We chose NR6, the 6 referring to those 6 statements you see. We asked participants to tell us how they feel from disagree strongly to agree strongly about each of those statements. And then we averaged their responses, and each participant had a unique mean NR6 score. There are many possible explanatory factors that could go into human nature connection. We chose 4 main components. We wanted a wildlife component. So we asked about species literacy and positive species sentiment. I'll tell you what those are in just a minute. We had a demographic component. We asked age, gender, and educational level. We had a recreation component. So we asked respondents about the types of recreation activities as well as the frequency of participation in those during childhood and adulthood. And then we had a place-based set of questions. We asked all of these questions to community and conservation park visitors. And then we asked them, what was your main reason for coming to the park? How often do you come to this park? How long did you stay at the park? And how far is the park from your residence? Our hypotheses were that everything I just showed you on that previous screen would have a significant positive association with human nature connection. So species literacy and positive species sentiment, the number, frequency, and type of recreation activities during childhood and adulthood, that main reason for visitation as nature, and I'll tell you what that is in just a minute, greater length of visit, greater prior visitations, and the distance of the park to the residence we thought would be closer, that those factors would have a positive association with NR6. And then we also thought that our respondents that were older, female or had a higher educational level would have a positive association. And then in terms of park type, we thought that our conservation park visitors would have significant positive association with each of those factors in 1 through 4. We administered our survey in 6 parks in Madison, Wisconsin, 3 community and 3 conservation parks. They're located on the west, central, and eastern side of Madison. And you probably know that community and conservation parks are managed differently. In Madison, community parks are managed for recreation, so lots of things to do in community parks. Our conservation parks are managed for native plant and animal species. Lots to do there too, but different mission. We administered our survey by way of a postcard or a poster. The postcards were actively distributed at the parks, and then the posters were at the parks throughout our study survey period. And then the surveys could be accessed by way of a QR code. So, what is species literacy? We asked respondents to identify the animals in the image, and we had these separated out for this particular survey question. It was fill in the blank. And if they got it correct, they got a 1. If they were incorrect, and they were sometimes unexpectedly, they got a 0. And then we averaged those responses so that each respondent had a species literacy score. For positive species sentiment, we average responses across all 6 species. So we asked respondents, how would you feel about the animals in the image living at the park where you visited today? And if they indicated, I'm happy, or they think the animal is important for the ecosystem, those responses were scored a 1. Any of the other responses, so concerned about human health, human safety, find the animal a nuisance, those responses were scored a 0. And then across all 6 species, an average response for positive species sentiment. Main reason for visitation, we had 3 main categories for visitation: passive, active, and nature. Passive activities included things like picnicking, going to the playground, the splash park, attending an event at the park. Active is anything physical or sports related, also walking your dog goes under that category. And then nature is a subcategory of what is typically considered passive, but we pulled those out. So any response that had to do with nature photography, bird watching, just hanging out in nature, those responses were categorized under nature. And recreational activities. We had 9 possible recreation activities. We asked respondents to tell us the number they participated in during childhood and adulthood, 2 separate questions, and then the frequency of participation. So how often did you do these different activities? We focused in on 3 of the most frequent so that we didn't overly penalize individuals who participated in 1, 2, or 3, but at a high level compared to individuals who participated in all of them, but at a much lower level. For our analysis early on, park type became a significant factor. And so from the beginning, we separated out the data into two buckets, if you will. So we had our community park visitors and all of that data, and our conservation park visitors and that data. And then we developed single variable models for each of these factors to look at the association that each of these factors had with that mean NR6. A little bit about our park visitor compared to our Madison residents. For gender, there was no significant difference, but our park visitors are significantly, or were in this study, significantly older and more educated. So what did we find for NR6, age, main reason, length of visit, and prior visitations? Age was significant for both community and conservation park visitors. Main reason and length of visit was significant for our community park visitors, whereas prior visitation was significant for our conservation park visitors. We did not find any significance regarding gender, educational level, or distance of residents to the park. If we look at that in terms of pairwise comparison within each of those components, we can see that for community park visitors, for age, we have that age category 55 to 64 having significantly higher mean NR6 than 3 other age categories from 18 to 44. And then for main reason for coming as nature, so that was that nature photography, bird watching, just hanging out in nature, those individuals had significantly higher mean NR6 than individuals who came to the park for passive reasons, splash park, playground, going to an event. When we looked at length of visit, individuals who spent greater than 2 hours at the park had significantly higher NR6 than those who spent less than 1 hour at the park. When we go over the conservation park visitors side, we see that age is also significant in the 65 to 74-year-old age category, being higher than the 25 to 34. Prior visitations, we asked participants, how many times have you been to this park in the last year? And those who said they'd been there 20 times, greater than 20 times, had significantly higher than those who'd never been there until the day they took the survey. And I find that output really fascinating for 2 reasons. One, I look at that and say, so do people who come to conservation parks already have high nature connection? And if they do, I find them a fascinating group to study further. So that's, what brought you there? What are some of these other possible factors that went into it? Your level of nature connection. And then I look at that and I see 0 times. How can we get these people there? What are some things we can do in terms of, yes, staying on our mission for conservation parks, but bringing in people to just expose them to more different kinds of parks, to a conservation park, and seeing that those parks are of great value, and hopefully they would become attached to those sorts of parks as well. When we look at literacy, sentiment, number, and frequency of activities, for community park visitors, literacy was not a significant factor, but it was for our conservation park visitors. And in terms of sentiment, that was a significant factor for community park visitors, but not for conservation park visitors. And then recreation in childhood and adulthood was significant for both groups. If we look at recreation a little more closely, this is in terms of frequency, we can see that for community park visitors, 9 out of 9 activities were significant indicators for mean NR6 in childhood, and 8 out of 9 for adulthood, only excluding hunting in adulthood. And then when we look at our conservation park visitors, we can see that 6 out of 9 of the recreation activities were significant. Bit of a swap there between nature photography and picnicking, adulthood and childhood. And then I'm showing you camping, but we did this for any significant recreation activity, and it's symbolic of each of those other activities as well. Individuals who participate at those higher levels, that often, very often level, have significantly higher NR6 than individuals who are participating never or very rarely. And again, that was a recurring theme across all recreation activities that were significant. So overall, I think the most encouraging aspect of this study is the potential impact of recreation activities, because that's something we can do something about. We can, in our communities, as much as possible, often the broadest range of recreation opportunities in a nature-based place, and have those appeal to people at multiple different points in their lives and at different age levels as well. And then for wildlife species literacy and sentiment, I think it's important to, and I think everyone in this room already knows this, but educational programming that's just bullet point, this is the animal, this is their life history. Don't you feel like me now? Aren't they cool? That's not necessarily successful, that you really have to not just nod to differences in sentiment, but weave that into your programming and accommodate for differences in feelings about animals. Am I up?
You're good.
Okay.
You actually hit it right on the 15-minute mark, so we've got some time for some questions.
All right, I just want to do a quick thank you to the students who participated, helped me distribute these surveys. I could not have done this without them. They were prioritizing those Saturday survey mornings, and I greatly appreciate their participation. And then, of course, also the co-authors on this project, Elizabeth Perry and David Drake. So thank you very much.
All right. Right in the front. Great.
Awesome, cool stuff. The themes that you wrote out into reason for being there, are those themes that have that you coded for, or are they preconceptions that you had already in designing the survey?
So those three categories of main reason, that's a great question. One of the, three reviewers on the paper asked us the same thing. That is not standardized in the literature. There are so many different ways to categorize recreation activities, from the basic passive active to really compartmentalizing them for various reasons based on your research objective, perhaps what you're trying to determine in a particular type of recreation. So is it mechanized recreation? Is it appreciative recreation? Is it consumptive, that fishing, hunting? So lots of ways to divvy up the pie. Yeah.
Did you run validation on that part of the survey? Because it'd be great to put that out there for us.
I can, when you say validation, in terms of what?
For consistency in people that were responding under that section, that it was always under that section.
I did not, but that would be interesting to know. That would be, yeah, thanks.
He had his hand up next. I saw it.
Okay, quick question. The animals, which one was the most recognized one and which wasn't? And how did you treat if someone would write, this could be a fox, or this could be a gray fox, or this could be a squirrel, or whatever? Did you count that or not?
We got some really interesting answers for some of that. And I wasn't able to tell you about those additional questions, but we did ask additional questions. So in terms of accuracy, the animal that was misidentified the most often was coyote, and it was misidentified typically as a wolf, and that actually had an influence on their sentiment. So that was interesting to me, and certainly important in terms of programming. And then if I got multiple responses, I'm an educator, so as a teacher, you're like, sorry, just because you put it all on the page doesn't mean I have to pick out which one's accurate. So that would have just been.
Okay, we probably have time for one more question. I know I saw another hand, and there you go. Yeah.
Just real quick, what was your response rate? How many respondents did you have?
Oh, and that was on one slide, but sorry,
Sorry,
I should have stated that from the beginning. So we had 560 total. We had 291 community park and 269 conservation parks. Yeah, so we had for the cards, because we could monitor that, we had a 40% response rate, which is actually pretty decent for surveys.
Got about another 45 seconds. Anybody going once, going twice? You want to start getting comfortable up front?
All right, thank you, Bill.
So these arrows working very well, so I recommend if you just click on that.
I don't do this. I try my best.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay.
You can start down here. Yeah, I would like to say.
Mush.
All right, our next speaker is Simon Mosh. He'll be doing what we think of urban wildlife, perceptions of citizens and decision makers. All yours, I'll let you know when you're finished.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to my talk. And from now, I'm taking you from the amazing work that's done in the US to Germany. And So we're the country of cars and soccer and beer. I'm also making a bit of advertisement for Germany now. We're the size of Montana. So and we have 83 million people. Montana has 1 million people. So you can see there might be a lot of wildlife conflicts happening in such a small space with so many people. I brought you a small selection of our wild mammals. We have wild boars, we have red squirrels. They're a bit nicer than your squirrels. We have hedgehogs, we have hare, we have marten, we have deer, rabbits, foxes. Newly returned animals are beavers and wolves. And the invasive species, you probably heard me lots talking about them. It's raccoons from your country and scorpions from South America. You'll see the raccoon makes, lots of problems for Germans. So we have lots of wildlife conflicts in Germany. So this is my favorite one. This is happened when I just started my PhD in August 2020. This happened in the summer. It's a very popular nudist beach in Berlin. And there's lots of trash there. There's party people leaving their stuff there. And this guy got his laptop stolen and was chasing it. Then we had this. This is a raccoon that was like walking around at the Christmas market. And people were like, what is this animal doing there? And it got killed in the end, not by professionals. There's accidents with the wild boars and cars. There is like reconnection to nature. This girl is looking to grow closer to a squirrel. And this is right in the center of Berlin. This was a very historic tree. People were very mad at it because it was planted by a former emperor. There were like a bunch of them. I'm not sure if it's exactly that one, but there was a lot of outrage about, the historic trees right across from the island, the Museum Island in Berlin. So a bit of a background. I'm pretty sure you heard all about it. The Urban Wildlife Research established in the 80s. Urban green spaces are a great habitat for wildlife. Focus is lots on conflicts instead of coexistence, but it's changing. I think this is what we're all here for. The main two centers of research are, there's research of habitats of urban wildlife where they're occurring, and there's the research of perception towards urban wildlife, but a change is also happening because there is talk about multi-species planning to include more wildlife within cities. So this brings me to my PhD. My question is, which measures lead to a conflict-free coexistence of human and wildlife in settlements? So we have on the one side, we have increase of an urban population, and on the other side, we have hemerophilic wildlife who really like to live very close to us. So at first, my first package is, what do citizens think? Which wildlife do they prefer? What are their emotions toward wildlife? The next one is, I talk to experts who are decision makers in cities. How should we manage these wildlife, and which species do you have in your focus? And the last one, which just started, I'm working with Marufa in Freiburg. We want to see where the interactions of citizens and wildlife, looking at camera traps. So I'm going to walk you through the first two, and the last one, it's just going to be one slide because there's not much results yet. So we did a big survey, which is already pretty old, so I hope it gets published soon. We did this, we did this right after the wild boar. It was very new, like, oh, the wild boar is there in Berlin. So we did it all across Germany. We let it run for 100 days. We have lots of responses because this was during COVID lockdown, so people didn't have anything to do, and Facebook had a revival. They're like, okay, I'm going to fill out a survey. So all across Germany, in total, we had 4,000 answers. We could use 3,000 of them because I said only if you made it to the last slide, I'm going to use your response. We targeted these 12 species. I talked about all of them already. And as it's usually with a lot of wildlife surveys, lots of females participated. We have a great age diversity. We have people with academic degrees and without. We have lots of urban people participating, and lots of people with no children under, with no children. Most people had a garden, most people had a car, and most people had a dog. So the two questions I was asking is, what preference do you have? We followed a paper by Ruprecht 2017, where we just asked which animal would you like to see and which animal would you not like to see in your settlement areas. People could list up to 5 they liked and 5 they didn't like. Oh, we got also lots of interesting stuff on there. People didn't want to see elephants. And yeah, those were not selected within my finals. And for the emotions, we have the 12 selected animals, and we ask which of these following emotions do you feel? And following a paper by Gamzi et al., we group them into the positive, the indifferent, and the neutral ones, so I could run my models. So the results of the models are the preference. Everybody loves squirrels in Germany. Hedgehogs are right after, but the fox are a bit undecided. Hare and deer are fine. And then it comes to all these animals where they're like, nah, I don't want to see them within my surroundings. So the marten, they didn't want to see, raccoons not, they put wolves down, and like, wolves are not an urban animal. I didn't include the wolf within, the later emotion questions because I thought this would not be an issue. Rats, of course, and then also wild boars. So, and looking at these wonderful models, which I was running, I'm just going to give you a quick overview. So gender was highly significant. Females were more positive about pretty much all the wildlife than their male parts. The older were positive about the squirrels, the hedgehogs, foxes, deer, and raccoons, but the older people were also more negative about rats. The urban people were more negative about rats, and the rural people were more negative about beavers. And when it comes to education, those with an academic degree were more positive about wild boar, maybe knowing about their ecosystem services. And those with children, they didn't like marten and rats, the one that could be a bit scary. And looking next to emotion, we only asked the people who had seen the animal how they felt about encountering the animal. So the hedgehog and the squirrel are the most encountered animal, which overlaps with which animals do we want to see. And it also overlaps that raccoon and wild boar, which were unpreferred, were also not seen very often. And as you see, most of these bars are green. So it means the people encountering them had a positive feeling about encountering them. So actually, people are scared to see the animals, but if they see them, it's not that bad. The only exception about the rat, they did not like the rat. So gender as well was highly significant, and people who had cars, they didn't like the martens. But the martens go in the cars, and those with children, they like the rabbits, deer, squirrels, so all the animals that are in the Bambi movie. So we also ask, what negative impacts do you connect with these animals? So we have lots of selected negative impacts. We looked at the literature first. We asked for attack, for a car crash, for a bunch of illnesses, and my favorite one, the morbus illness. Has anyone heard of the morbus illness? No, it's fake. It doesn't exist. So if we look at what were high points of this, so it's rats and parasites, it's the deer and the wild boar and the marten, the car crash, the foxes and rabies. I told to many people yesterday, we're free of terrestrial rabies. We could still have rabies from bats, but the last rabies in a terrestrial mammal in Germany has occurred in 2002. So it's a bit of nonsense to be afraid of rabies from foxes. And the only, no one was fooled by the morbus, only the rats, like a bit of where people were like, I'm just afraid of everything for rats. So if we plot the animals that have been encountered and the animals that are preferred, we have the 4 categories of not preferred and many encounters, where it's the rat and the marten. We have the category of preferred and encountered often, which are most the animals, and most the animals that are also in the Bambi movie. The beavers, few encounters, it's fairly new, but it's still preferred. People talk a lot about how it has a very good ecosystem effect. And the ones who are not preferred are the raccoon and the korku, which are invasive species, which makes sense. They're not everywhere yet in Germany, but the wild boar is also not encountered as much as these positive people, but still not preferred very much. Reasons we thought of was the rats and the health effect that was discussed in the literature and that showed up in our surveys. It's the marten and the car connection. It's wild boar and fear of attacks. It's the invasive species. Yeah, there's all the Bambi images. And the fox, Germany likes the fox animals. Oh, I have to go fast. Okay, Germany likes the fox because the fox is in a lot of fairy tales. So jumping over to the interviews I did interviews with experts in Germany. There were roughly about 45 minutes. We aimed for an hour, but it was COVID time, so I had to do them over Zoom. So people were like, I have to go somewhere else very fast and click goodbye. I talked to city administration and green spaces, urban hunting association, conservation NGOs, and private experts like photographers or authors who had lots of experience in the fields. The species that were named most often within the interviews were foxes, wild boar, marten, and raccoon. You've heard about them before, but if you look at the far end, wolves didn't play a major role, and squirrels and hedgehog also. The colors show how if they connect them with a negative or a positive impact. Looking at the positive and negative impacts, those negative ones where they mentioned was damage to private properties as the highest, followed by diseases and fear. And the animals in these boxes are those animals that can connected by the experts with the impact. And on the other side, you see the most positive impact being listed by experts of having wildlife in settlement areas is the wildlife observation with lots of animals brought up as example. But all the other stuff you find down here, livability in cities and consideration, biodiversity, reconnection to nature, they're not connected to specific animals. They're more connected to wildlife in general. So the conclusion of this is that the negative impacts are always connected to certain species, and the positive impacts are just broadly wildlife in general. Looking at the management methods I asked them about, we talked about hunting mostly connected to wild boar, deer, and the invasive species, kaypoh and raccoon. Majority saw it as necessary to hunt, and especially hunting for if there's damage, like this is the damaged graveyard, and there's injured foxes. But there's also more than just hunting in terms of management. There's also environmental education. Focus was the introduction into schools, which they said is very needed, tours and talks, topics for general biology of wildlife, and also the behavior if you spot a wildlife. Urban planning was also raised, where it was the inclusion and exclusion of certain wildlife in urban areas, excluding wild boar from graveyards and cemeteries, include hedgehogs into newer built parks, and also our green spaces in the cities are not that great, so we need to enhance them, connect them with each other, protect them before something gets built on it, and assign them certain species so we can manage it properly and have these umbrella species. So the next step that is going on is the last chapter of the PhD. That would be the work I'm doing with Marufa and Freiburg. These are the camera traps. I'm finishing in time, perfect. And yeah, we targeted we redone my survey just for Freiburg with fewer questions, just run it for a short time and spread it in the circles close to the cameras. So we want to see which animals are occurring on our camera traps, which animals are liked, and which animals are seen. And the outlook, so in the interviews, there are the frequent 5, which is raccoon, marten, wild boar, beaver, and fox. And they're the most in need for a better population control, for education and planning measures. The squirrels and hedgehogs do not play a big role within the interviews, even though they are the mammals that are focused by the public. So in a way to engage the public more into conservation efforts done in cities, you also have to talk more about the ones that are like hedgehogs and squirrels, how to include hedgehogs in new buildings. And yeah, they can act as ambassadors. And with this, I am done.
So with that in mind, yeah, so far we're doing really good on hitting our marks. So we actually have several, we have time for questions, so if you would, raise your hand and let's get started. Mr. Polly.
I missed your initial comment. Why are the martens going into automobile?
So we have pine martens and stone martens. So stone martens, they are very, very densely there in urban areas. We have lots of them in the camera traps in Freiburg. So they like to go in the car where it's still nice and warm, and it becomes like a habitat fight. When the cars are moving from one place to another, it smells like another marten. They go in there and they eat in there. They chew on the cables.
So they're just going in the engine compartment.
They're going in the engine compartment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sam?
So in the nature of human conflict, have there been any injuries of individuals with any of your target species?
Well, of course, there are always some small injures. We also asked about have you been injured or something, but there are not many answers except someone being bitten by a squirrel or something. There's always talks in the newspaper.
Sure.
But like I didn't look deeper into that because it was so insignificant.
I noticed that there was like a high bar in fear of rat attack. And then also people were saying that they had bad encounters with rats. But unlike the bad encounters with other animals, I wonder, is that like a circular thing where it's bad just because of the fear? Or were you able to differentiate like something bad had actually happened to them from seeing a rat?
Like we have all these answers, but I made the mistake on like giving them a field to answer. So I just skimmed through them and we're like starting to categorize. Most people are just afraid of rats, so they just
So
say,
it's a bad experience because they're afraid of them.
yeah. It's just like they just say the reason to hate rats is disgusting.
Right.
So,
Oh, we still got time. We're good. Anybody else got one? Yes, ma'am. Simon's calling.
Can you repeat, I missed the part about, the perceptions of the fox as influenced by fairy tales. You said it was positive or negative?
Oh, it's positive. So the fox is always shown as a very smart, nice animal, and they have a lot of news like being out like. So there was a whole thing about that we had a fox in the garden of our presidents, and like he was like, should we name him? Let's make the public about it. So, and especially in urban areas, it's like a new phenomenon with foxes, and people like them very much.
Oh, shit.
Did you see any differences in the preferences based on the city size or how close the people were living to the forest?
So we asked for the postal code, but we had such a big, so we asked for urban and rural, like so postal code, we calculated the urban and rural divides. And people in urban areas tended to be more positive to the a bit more damaging carnivorous ones. Because yeah, people in the countryside, they didn't like them. They're like they need to have the car to drive around somewhere, so the mark was more negative.
Right.
Hmm?
Like the big carnivore?
And the wolves, but it's obvious that the wolves are like more in city areas than in urban. The wolves are more like in urban than in rural areas.
So it was more about exposure and how much you.
That would be the conclusion.
You have a question?
I was wondering, I'm unfamiliar, sorry, with the koifu and what's its ecological impact into this.
So I think you have koifu's in the United States as well.
Is it nutria?
Yeah, nutria and koifu, that's the animal, and you know, they're doing some gnawing on the roots at waterways, but in Germany, it's not a major impact yet. The Dutch people, they're like afraid of it because pretty much they flood everything and they explode everything on water. So they do need certification programs in Germany. It's not that big yet.
2 minutes? Come on, y'all are getting crowd. We got.
I came in from Germany.
Oh, that's a quick. Do you know how long the red foxes have been in Berlin?
There's like some talk about this,
Mm-hmm.
but no. So, but like everybody says that they, you know, the phenomenon started in London first.
Yeah.
And now it's the Zurich experts there. Yeah, do you know when the foxes were in Zurich?
I think it's like the 90s, early.
Because I
20 years after London, they started in Central Europe.
I think we're similar. So London was first, and then word spread that cities are cool.
Yeah, they came over here too in our cities.
Were you surprised by any of the results? Specifically, like that stand out to either the experts or the public?
I was surprised that hedgehogs were so like, you're the hedgehog experts. I was so surprised that the hedgehogs did not play a major role, you know, talking about urban planning and urban conservation, and just a few mentioned that we have hedgehogs in cities. But talking to other people, hedgehogs, you know, are more city animals than rural animals. So I was very, you know, it's that divide of, you know, we like them so much, and then it's like we don't talk about them much. I think that was, and it was
No offense.
and wolves. It was surprising, but that's all.
For our next session, we have Karina Sanchez. We'll be doing, it's not just noise, it's consequences of inequitable noise for urban wildlife.
So I recommend clicking here, advance your slides, because this doesn't work.
You watching for yourself?
Okay,
Yeah, it's just
Cool.
clicking.
sweet. So I just drank half a bottle of energy drink. So if I am speaking fast, that is why. Yeah, so I'm Karina Sanchez. I'm a postdoc at the University of New Hampshire, and today I'm going to be talking about a very large project. So just want to start off by acknowledging I did not do all of this work. This was a big collaboration between many people at several institutions. I also want to highlight that most of these authors, my co-authors, are graduate students. And our two first authors on this manuscript are two graduate students. So it's been really awesome to work with them and see what they have brought to the table. So I just want to put up there. Okay. We are all here because we like urban areas, urban ecosystems, urban landscapes. And if you put it simply, we can think that these landscapes are influenced by our infrastructure, they're influenced by human activities, and then there's also the factors of the biology, right? That was there before and the biology that is there now. But in reality, these are cities, and these landscapes are driven and defined by social inequities. So what do I mean by that? Well, when we think about social inequities, these come from biases that individuals have, and these biases can drive many things that we put into cities, drive our policies, urban planning, and one in particular is how do we spend our money? All of these are going to be impacting the entire urban ecosystem, how it's built, and how the wildlife in them are going to respond to it. So one blatant way that we have created segregated cities is through redlining in the US. So this is something that several other people have spoken about at this conference. So hopefully this is feeling familiar to many of you, but I just will recap that this was organized by the Homeowners Loan Corporation in cities. And essentially what this was decisions made to provide money to some people and not provide money to others. And that money was used for developing areas, to acquiring property, and they literally took maps, drew lines on them, and decided who are we going to give money to and who are we not going to give money to. If you were assigned in an A or a B neighborhood, you were more likely to get a loan to acquire property. If you were in a C, you were less likely to get that money to build a home in that area. So this was their way of going around who are the people that are asking for these loans, and said that they're asking for a loan in this neighborhood. And if it's in that neighborhood, they only get this much money. And then if you were in a D, which is where the redlining term comes from, you were considered to be in an area that is hazardous. These are all terms they came up with. So this is how they defined these neighborhoods and chose which areas they were going to invest in with money, literally, and in those communities as well. So the legacy of segregation manifests today. There's this guy, that guy. Ever heard of him? Everyone has seen this paper brought up in this figure several times, but essentially this was a pivotal paper that really brought to the forefront for scientists and not just urban ecologists, but the fact that environmental amenities and disamenities are not equally distributed in cities. So I'm going to give you some examples of that, but before I do, I want to orient you to this map. So this is a map of Denver. Most of my collaborators on this project are in the Denver area, and this is a map showing the 4 grades of the HOLC grades. I apologize for the red and green being on there. We just wanted to stick with the colors that they provided. But basically, I will point out on all of these maps where an A and B neighborhood is and a C and D neighborhood. So it's going to be the same city for these next few examples. Just wanted to orient you to that.
So the next map I'm going to show you is essentially showing you the proportion of non-white individuals. So the darker the color on the map means that there are more non-white people living there. You know, and then the whiter colors on the map mean that there are white people living there. So if we look at our two neighborhood categories that we've broken out here, it's very obvious that the C and D categories have more minority individuals living there. And the A and B categories have fewer. This is today. This demographic is not based on when these practices were put in place. This is today. So we know who is living where. What are they being exposed to? Well, here's impervious surface. So people in C and D neighborhoods, the darker the color means more impervious surface. So C and D neighborhoods have more impervious surface, and A and B neighborhoods have less. And we can do the same for tree cover. So again, darker the color, the more trees in that area. A and B is pretty dark, lots of tree cover there. Not as much in the C and D neighborhoods. And then finally, we can look at the health aspects that people are being exposed to. So this is a map showing toxic waste release sites. So each dot on here is a release location. And so up on the top is a C and D neighborhood, and the same A and B neighborhoods over here. You can see there are many red dots. Above, there are 0 red dots in the A and B neighborhoods. So, and this is Colorado, so many of these red dots are representing oil fracking sites. So that is typically the chemical release spots that are being associated. So I give you all of these examples because this is not by chance, right? These things were put into place and these ultimate effects have manifested from those policies. And this is what really drove the group of people that I work with to say, okay, we know all of this stuff about the landscape. Let's think beyond the landscape and now think about the sensory pollutants, right? Now we're going to think about whether noise pollution is also inequitably distributed. So in general, there are studies that have showed communities of color experience greater noise pollution. There have been several studies that have come out about that, but there has been no explicit study demonstrating that this is an impact from the legacy of redlining. So that's what we did. We wanted to quantify noise across these different cities, across these different neighborhoods. We use USDOT, so US Department of Transportation data, to essentially map out 83 cities across the states that have historical redlined districts. This is not a practice that is in place anymore, so these are all historical. So we mapped out on 83 cities and essentially pulled out how loud each of those neighborhoods are. So I just want to give you a reference for, before I go into the results, how loud those neighborhoods are for what those numbers mean. So 40 decibels is kind of our day-to-day, what we hear ambient noise. You can hear bird calls, something that you might hear in like a library, at the loudest in a library. 70 decibels is if you're standing near a freeway, you can hear the traffic, a vacuum cleaner in your hand. Once you get up to 100 decibels, this is like a power lawnmower. This is where you will cause some significant damage to your eardrum if you're exposed to it for long term. And 120 decibels is pretty stinking loud, probably the loudest thing you'll ever hear until your ears get busted. So this is kind of the range we are looking at. So about 70 decibels is when you should start worrying, right? So what did we find? We found a lot of things, but I'm just showing you one graph from this work. And what I want you to see is that we have our A, B, C, and D neighborhoods. On the x-axis are cumulative number of cities. So this many cities found this loud in their area of decibels. So what I want you to notice is that each neighborhood has a different spread, right? what I want to point out is that at the 70 decibels, this is what the EPA describes as should be dangerous to humans. At the 90 decibels, this is very dangerous for human hearing and human health. Now notice the difference between the spread at that 90 decibel area in the A neighborhoods. There's more variation when you get higher. In the D neighborhoods, there's a lot more happening towards the louder areas. So this is happening, right? And it is nationwide. This is for 83 cities, and these are pretty consistent things that we're seeing. I just want to point out that this paper is under revision right now, and it is also a preprint out there. So if you want to see all of the results, you can do that. So we all study wildlife. So what does that mean for wildlife? Does it matter that it's noisier in some areas? We know it does, right? So we know that wildlife have been impacted by noise. This is the Graham Shannon paper that came out, a pivotal paper really summarizing the impacts of noise on wildlife. And we know it impacts wildlife, right? And we know that not only are wildlife impacted by excess noise, but they are also, that noise radiates beyond the city, right? Infrastructure is infrastructure in the city. And the sound might start there, but it leaves the city and goes beyond that permanent structure. So we did a literature search because we were not going to go to 83 cities and study wildlife in all of them. So we collected from all of the other scientists. We had 223 papers that told us that fit our criteria that we were looking for only in urban areas. Only 70 of those papers reported decibel levels. So if you're working in noise pollution, I'm watching. Please report the decibels, right? Tell us what those numbers are, because we want to know at what point do wildlife start to suffer, right? And basically what we found is that so on the x-axis is the decibel level at which a study found a significant response. So essentially, the more papers you review, the more evidence we have that wildlife are responding to noise significantly. And in many ways. So these two graphs are showing what they were studying about noise responses, vocalization, vigilance, population, and different taxa. And I don't need you to read these graphs, but what I need you to see is that they are all there, right? We have studied all the taxa, not all of them, but many of the taxa, and they are all significantly responding to noise, and in many behavioral differently ways. So these implications are big, right? It means that areas and neighborhoods of redlined, historically redlined neighborhoods are going to have reduced biodiversity. And we know that areas with reduced biodiversity are going to also have the impacts of lack of access to wildlife. And these residents are going to not only be impacted directly, but also indirectly. There's evidence that shows that being exposed to more diversity contributes to your overall wellness and your well-being. And what we have shown is that it's more than just the habitat, right? If you do not incorporate noise into your urban planning, you can put lots of trees there, but that noise is going to perpetuate beyond that area. So we will not have equitable cities unless we incorporate all of the aspects of what makes a city a city. I went so long, but huge project, tons of people to thank. I don't have time for questions, I don't think. Oh, I do, great.
You're good.
I'm done. That's it. Oh, yeah.
With the decibels that you were seeing from each of the 83 cities that you're looking at, was the decibel like the average within?
All of the urban. So I think age really matters.
Yeah.
How long those species have been exposed is going to matter.
All right, let's go ahead and. Thank you very much. Yeah,
The time on there isn't right.
Okay, thank you.
give me just a second.
Okay.
If y'all haven't noticed, I do tend to run things fairly right on time. All right, our next presentation is by Nancy Lawson. Titled, Yes. Yes, in my backyard, welcoming wildlife and HOA communities. And go.
Hello. So everything in this nest here, which is in my backyard, is something that's actually been not allowed in homeowners association community somewhere around the country, and many of them around the country. Mosses, pine needles, twigs, fallen leaves, they're just banned from front yards and backyards, even though they're the making of someone else's home. These natural elements are, of course, construction materials and egg-laying sites for Carolina wrens and fireflies and bumblebees and all sorts of creatures. But in my decade of giving talks and writing about wildlife habitat, I've heard from lots of homeowners around the country who aren't allowed to leave these things for animals. So it's a topic I feel really close to, I've been working on for a long time. And I feel kind of a duty to help people with this because I'm trying to help them create habitat, and they essentially have not been allowed to. But one day in 2017, the issue became even more personal for me when my sister was cited for her wildlife garden in her HOA. And then for more than 3 years, the Beech Creek Homeowners Association in Columbia, Maryland, spent $100,000 trying to destroy this garden. And they ultimately didn't succeed. And in fact, they failed so spectacularly that not only has this garden remained in place, but the state of Maryland passed a law codifying the right of everyone living in HOAs to have environmentally friendly landscaping. So Janet and Jeff's case really launched a movement, and these were huge victories, but it took a heavy emotional toll. And while this case may seem extreme, unfortunately, as we've discovered, it's not. It's just that a lot of people give up before we really ever hear about what they're going through. And that's because the HOA system has historically been so hard to fight. It's very different from trying to work with weed laws because weed laws are created by governments, which have more accountability, and people can go to the media, they can go to elected officials, they can appeal to people's senses and common sense. But in HOAs, there's little accountability. Often there's only 1 or 2 people who are in charge and really dominate. In my sister's case, it was just one neighbor who had a complaint, and he was in close contact with the board president, and they colluded for several years. Up until now, you know, there's been very little avenue for gaining public support because people are afraid, especially people living in these communities. Even when neighbors are supportive, they're afraid the HOA is going to come after them. So wildlife friendly people living in these communities sometimes need all the help that they can get, but often the typical reactions to their plight are along these lines. I would never live in an HOA, or you know, I advise you not to buy in an HOA, and we hear that time and time again, and I think it's not very fair and not very reasonable because a lot of places there isn't much other choice. That's the nature of the housing market. American real estate is really tied up in HOAs. In recent years, nearly 75% of homes sold were part of HOA communities. Almost 75 million Americans live in HOAs, condo communities, or cooperatives, and that adds up to 40 million households. That's a lot of people, but it's also a chance to transform a lot of land to environmentally friendly landscaping. If we just stop sort of throwing up our hands and saying there's nothing we can do. There's no one cookie cutter situation that people are going to encounter because every homeowners association is different. But generally speaking, this is the dividing line. You can be in a community where people are reasonable and they just haven't heard of this topic before. They're just not familiar with the importance of habitat in residential communities, or you can be dealing with unreasonable people who are on the board for all the wrong reasons, for power or control or some other reason that goes against the grain of the community's best interests. So the responses to this sort of thing need to vary too. Some have to necessarily be reactive. The homeowner who's facing mounting fines might need quick intervention. So letters of support from horticulturists or wildlife biologists or landscape designers, or even in-person visits can really help in certain situations to explain things to the naysayers. And then over time, a more proactive long-term educational approach can gradually introduce people to the concept. And that includes things like native plant sales, tree giveaways, talks by urban wildlife experts, and these other events that kind of help demystify things for people. In my sister's case, it quickly escalated to bullying and harassment from the HOA's hired lawyers. They could never actually cite any violation of the architectural guidelines or of the bylaws. So they just used intimidation tactics. They wrote in their citation letters that Janet and Jeff Crouch, my sister and brother-in-law, had an environmentally sensitive agenda, as if it was a bad thing. That they have plantings that grow back every year. That a planned community is no place for a garden that doesn't use pesticides and includes native plants to feed birds and bees. I mean, Simon talked about in Germany, you know, what animals do they like and don't like? Well, they didn't like anything at all. Numerous squirrels coming to the garden, as well as snakes and deer and other animals. So they were just throwing the whole kitchen sink in there. It's all part of the same playbook that law firms that work closely with these HOAs use to try to intimidate people into paying fines. And they often get away with repeatedly recycling these really tired myths that lawns are the ideal standard and are great for property values, that wildlife gardens attract pests, that native plants are messy and wild, and that pollinator gardens are dangerous. One of the most common suggestions for fighting back in these situations is to post a sign to help educate the community, but in this case that backfired. The lawyer took my sister's habitat sign as proof of her malfeasance. She actually wanted to attract and help wildlife and admitted to it, so she was ordered to take the signs down. Yet, as we later pointed out in our outreach efforts, pesticide signs are not only allowed, they're required when people are spraying throughout the community, and they leave them up for weeks and weeks on end. So you're actually allowed to tell people when you don't have a safe place, but you're not allowed to post signage about your safe haven. So we use that in our outreach efforts, and we also took a look at all the myths and dissected them one by one so we could make the community aware of what was really going on here. Myth number one, that lawns sell houses and wildlife gardens don't. You can see here the pretty flowers on my sister's side and this patchy blue weird grass on the other side. And the idea that crappy lawns sell houses certainly doesn't match what landscape architects say about consumer demand. There have been a couple of surveys where they say that close to 85% of the architects say that native plantings are the #1 trend. And another recent survey showed that pollinator loss was among their clients' top concerns. We also looked for real estate agents who could help us, and a top selling agent in our area was more than happy to sign on as an expert witness in Janet's case. And she doesn't equate barren lawns with property values and higher sales at all. In fact, she's a huge proponent of pollinator gardens as an asset to home sales. And the proof is in the pudding. Janet's next door neighbor on the other side, a woman who's a good friend of hers, actually just recently sold her house at a record price for the community. And not only that, but I was there helping my sister in her front yard one day, and all the potential buyers and agents were coming by, and they commented on how beautiful this garden was. And the house sold within a few days of being on the market. So clearly not a deterrent. Over the long term, there are things that real estate agents advise us to do. Think we can submit articles to Zillow and Redfin. They're always looking for content. We can do continuing education to the realtor pool because they need credit, and help them learn about these issues. And also work with green builders would be kind of an ideal to create templates for native foundation plantings and trees. Myth number 2, that these gardens attract pests. This is so pervasive, as we all know all too well, but it's important to get the word out that these animals are actually thriving among us, whether we have habitat gardens or not. And in my sister's case, as in a lot of communities, the lawns back up to woodland and a park. And the developer, one thing they did do well was plant oak trees along the street. So of course, deer, raccoons, squirrels are all going to survive and thrive there. But even more importantly, of course, these animals aren't pests. So the whole premise is ridiculous, and we need to challenge these, really unsound, ecologically and scientifically incorrect statements. For example, in Janet's case, the same neighbor who launched the complaint also calls pesticide companies to kill mice and spray for spiders. Children in the neighborhood witnessed him killing a snake, which is illegal in Maryland and a lot of other places. So we called this out too, and we said, snakes are here, whether you like it or not. They're just good at hiding, so you don't normally see them. They're eating rodents. They're eating these other animals that you actually apparently despise. So you're really contradicting yourself here. And we were fortunate to have John Hadidian, who's here in the audience and wrote the book literally on coexisting with urban wildlife, sign on as an expert witness. And I really hope that more people in urban wildlife and more wildlife biologists will be able to help people in situations like this, because you can lend a lot of credibility and help people out. Accusations of mosquito attraction are also really common, even when they aren't at all applicable. This is my sister's backyard, where the ferns, the sedges, the violets mitigate stormwater. They slow it down, they absorb it. This is the yard of the neighbor who said she was attracting mosquitoes. He left standing water for weeks. He didn't have any plants to absorb the water. So also we address that in our outreach. The third common myth from the HOA playbook is that native plants are messy and wild. So one of our main arguments on that front was that these are all cultivated plants. They're purchased from mainstream nurseries, and we're supporting local businesses in addition to supporting the local ecosystem when we buy these plants. The last major myth in the HOA playbook is that pollinator gardens are dangerous because bees sting. And that's pretty pervasive. And this is why people grow up thinking bees are scary, because they think you have to put on a suit of armor just to be around bees. And so we're working in our county to really get the word out about native bees. And the vast majority of the public still doesn't even know they exist, let alone that most of them are solitary and very unlikely to sting. So as we worked on all these counter arguments, we had to also consider in our responses, what are the touch points here that the public generally finds important? What do they prioritize? Curb appeal, financial concerns of the HOA budget, environment and human health, environment and wildlife, sense of community among neighbors. And then we tackled all those issues on as many fronts as we could. We sent newsletters to Janus neighbors and to the broader community of activists, and also to sustainability leaders in our region to gather support. We went to events and met elected officials, like our state delegate, Terry Hill here. She was instrumental in helping to get the legislation passed. Janet posted about her situation to pollinator groups on social media, and got huge support there. One person even made a video for her that attracted a lot of attention to the case. And getting a seat on the board, if at all possible, is important. It's extremely frustrating for my sister to be on this board, but over the course of a couple of years, she was able to learn a lot about the secret way that they were operating. They were holding meetings off-site in places that residents couldn't easily get to, and she got to really examine a lot of their financial mismanagement. But there still wasn't a law yet, so she had no real protections, and she found the only law firm in the area who would take on such a case. They didn't know about native plants or wildlife, but they were really good at HOA case law, and so we were able to learn from each other and collaborate. But what we really wanted to do was get legislation passed so that others wouldn't have to hire lawyers, because most people can't afford to hire a lawyer to fight back on this kind of thing. And the law has already helped many people in Maryland fend off overreaching HOAs. It's been cited in court decisions, and it often is just used by homeowners as a way to reject violations. What's amazing is that the language of the law actually includes the importance of creating wildlife habitat, and also prohibits HOAs from requiring turf grass. There were a few things that led to successful passage. My sister found a supportive legislative office interested in helping, and then the drafters of the language modeled the legislation on an existing law that required HOAs to allow solar panels. And so they were able to do something that the legislators were familiar with. The language of the law is positive in that it's not a ban. So it's just introducing something that people should be allowed to do anyway. Our delegates got buy-in from stakeholders, even the Trade Association for HOAs, the Community Associations Institute, actually submitted testimony and support. On an ongoing basis, we have advised people with wildlife gardens to continue to add what landscape designers call cues to care. And this is actually a very important way to make wildlife gardens acceptable. And it's been studied by a landscape architect in Michigan named Joan Nussauer, that if you show signs of human intention, like mowed strips that help frame the view, or really show-stopping flowers that people sort of start to appreciate and recognize, like this native coral honeysuckle, that hummingbirds come to even while you're talking to neighbors if you plant this out front, so it gives you a nice conversation starter. Things like bird baths, bird houses help wildlife and also give people something to look at. Adding paths and seating areas so that people know that this is a space not just for wildlife, but for humans to enjoy. And then turning these natural habitat elements like stumps and stuff into something really pretty by putting a flower top on top or growing a flower garden around it. Lets gardeners keep important habitat while also making it acceptable. And then mixing in familiar plants people recognize, like hostas, can make a landscape more legible to the uninitiated. And then, of course, posting a sign, you might get cited if you're in the wrong community, but it can help in certain places. It can be a really good conversation starter. Ultimately, even my sister's own community has shifted completely. We just got a newsletter. She got a newsletter in April from the board of her HOA. Because of her efforts, they are doing this greening initiative where they are converting public lawn areas to meadow and encouraging people to plant native plants for wildlife and the environment. So sorry, I went a little bit over.
We do actually have a couple of minutes. So this is a very fascinating presentation. So yeah.
We have like for condo complexes where the common areas are like trying to put stuff there, but like the wig owners won't, but the actual owners won't allow it. Has that translated at all?
If it is an apartment complex where people own, it would, but not for renters.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
it's
the
not.
rental properties is still kind of an issue.
What's that?
So like the rental properties is still.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, as April Linton makes her way to the front, she'll be doing a presentation on wildlife rehabilitation in the nation's capital, engaging urban residents with nature. And start.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So hello, I'm April Linton from City Wildlife here in Washington, DC. City Wildlife is DC's only wildlife rehabilitation center. We've been open for 10 years now. And the center really emerged out of the vision of our co-founders, Ann Lewis and Jim Monsma, who have been part of the humane community in Washington for many years, and really saw this gap that people would call Washington Humane, that primarily cared for pets, and say, well, I have a bunny, or I have a snake, or I have these ducklings in my backyard, and I don't know what to do. And so that is how we initiated. And to date, City Wildlife has provided emergency and critical care to more than 15,000 animals of more than 100 different species, many of which are species of greatest conservation need in the district. Equally important, I think, is that City Wildlife maintains an active phone bank open every day to assist callers on resolving wildlife issues. And I'm going to get back to that later because I think that's really key to what we're talking about, the human element and connecting urban ecology, wildlife biology with the public. We also run two major citizen science programs, Duck Watch and Lights Out, which we're going to tell you about as well. And beyond that, now we're engaged in a number of educational outreach and advocacy activities. So to meet the needs of both the animals and the humans we serve, we've developed relationships with various institutions. So governmental, the National Park Service, DC Energy and Environment, and Humane Rescue Alliance, among many others. Our collaboration with HRA, or Humane Rescue Alliance, is very close because they provide the transport for about half of the animals we take in. So individuals are not limited. They have found an injured animal, but they don't have a car, or they're taking care of their child, or they're working from home and they can't leave and bring it to us. HRA will actually pick that animal up and bring it to City Wildlife. So that's something that's been really important. They also refer people to us. And our citizen science project have engaged community members and built alliances with local nonprofits, government agencies, and others that will generally serve to benefit the urban wildlife. I just wanted to show you some of our patients. There on your left is our former veterinarian with a mallard patient. And here I just wanted to point out that over the past 25, 30 years, we've seen a shift in wildlife rehabilitation from being something that people kind of did. You had a lady down the street that fixed up the animals, or people who had certain skills, certain equipment, working out of their homes, to professionally staffed centers. And now you can have a career in wildlife rehabilitation. You're seeing more younger people at the wildlife professional meetings. And so this is a real positive trend. And this also allows rehabbers to be on the front lines of detecting wildlife diseases and monitoring, connecting with the community, educating the public, and also very significantly preventing people from inappropriately raising wildlife at home. So here we just have some of our intake trends. So obviously, when we first opened in 2013, not many people knew about us. We weren't getting very many animals. That went up very quickly. What you're seeing in 2020, a little bit of a drop because of the pandemic. 2021, our intake shot up. There was a mysterious bird disease, neurological symptoms. It was affecting a lot of fledglings, particularly starlings, grackles, corvids. So we just saw a lot of patients. And then the drop that you see here in 2022 was because of highly pathogenic avian influenza. And that disease which is in wildlife populations, particularly the waterfowl, has prevented us from taking in waterfowl temporarily. Because we don't have a way to quarantine them from the new ones from the older ones, or the waterfowl from the other birds. And so we've had to turn to other solutions for waterfowl, but we do look forward to being able to accept them again. So on this slide, we just wanted to talk a little bit about how wildlife rehabilitation is really, really important on its own, but it really ends up being the basis of a bigger pyramid. So because we have a wildlife center where people can bring injured and orphaned wildlife, that really allows us to have an effective lights out program where volunteers are collecting birds that have collided with glass, and some of those birds are alive, and we need someplace to take them to be observed and to be treated if necessary. Same with Duck Watch. The purpose of Duck Watch is to keep the mallard families or other waterfowl families together. But what if you have orphans? Got a place to take them. Our professional communications, when we have a center, again, that allows us to be able to track the disease trends we're seeing and to communicate those to other professionals. And for public communication, we talk to the press, we're on social media. A lot of this is also being on the phone, just talking to people. A lot of the people who call us end up never bringing an animal in because they learn from their conversation that no, that fledgling is okay. Put it back where you found it. Observe, are the parents coming? They might want some information about urban coyotes. We can connect them with experts who can talk to them about coyotes, etc. So it's not only about the animals coming to us, it's about the people coming to us and having that conversation. And then as we reach up to the top, Liz was going to talk a lot more about coalitions and advocacy. Everything we do has an aspect of engagement with the community, because when we're out there, people see us, people want to talk to us. Also on this slide, I want to just highlight an article from November 2021 in Urban Ecosystems. This is an article by Lauren Byrne, who encouraged ecologists to seek partnerships with community groups, but warned that they may not be able to develop or participate in extensive formal partnership, and that local stakeholders may not feel comfortable in formal academic and political settings. As a result, a broader array of approaches needs to be identified, developed, and shared. So the city wildlife model suggests that reaching out to urban wildlife centers that do rehab might be a good place for ecologists to start, because in an urban setting, the wildlife rehabber may well be the organization best poised to engage with the public and spur the public's interest and concern for wildlife. So now we'd like to say more about our field programs, and specifically with a focus on how we engage with the public. So I'm going to talk about Duck Watch, and for that, I'm going to put on my Duck Watch vest, which is a really important part of what we do, not only because—
Can we talk a little louder?
Sure. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Anne. There we go. So Duck Watch is a program that developed organically in response to public demand. People would call about a duck nest or ducks walking through the city. That could be like right where we are now. There are nests in Franklin Park, for instance. Historically, we have nests on some of the office buildings on I Street, really close to here. And often the people would say, well, why is the duck in the city? Or can we move the nest? And so we were all, we were aware that there were ducks living in DC and nesting in DC. And also we were aware of the need to improve some of the conditions we were seeing in the Capitol Reflecting Pool, which is a man-made structure, but it does attract lots of mallards. And so now every year we have about 25 trained volunteers who provide duck escorts and rescue duck families who are trapped on balconies or in courtyards. Last year, we had almost 100 duck and goose nests on our radar. And the volunteers also conduct regular monitoring at several sites that are important scientifically. They're important in a lot of ways, but scientifically they're important because monitoring on a daily basis can help us to have a baseline in case there's a disease outbreak or some sort of a weather event that may have an impact on the population. We're able to really see how high that impact is. And we've also successfully collaborated with the architect of the Capitol and the District Wharf, which is a new, very big waterfront development, to install ramps and floats so the ducklings and goslings can get out of the water. So I'm going to go through this part real quickly. You're seeing a duck pad at the wharf. Whoops. Okay. That one's supposed to animate. Let's see if I can get that to happen. Okay. In this situation, what I wanted to highlight is that a lot of what we do in Duck Watch, we couldn't do without the public. So on the left there, you see a couple of little ducklings. They're at the top of a stairway, and the mom and the other ducklings have gone down, and all the ducklings are trapped down there. The hitch is that the people in that house aren't home, and there's a high brick wall and a locked gate. And I can't climb that wall, but this guy could. And he did. He just sprung up the wall, went over. I handed him the bird cage. He put the ducklings in it, and there we are. And I've given him my vest. And we are walking from this residence. We're walking a short distance to the Capitol reflecting pool. Let's see. This one, I'll just say, this is a private condo space. There are nests here every year, and the people that live in the higher level condos monitor the ducks in the gardens below and let us know when there's nests and when there are families that are trapped that we need to get out. Here, maintenance people, facilities managers at National Geographic, Library of Congress, they at times are actually going out on the ledge literally to help the goslings get down, the ones that don't want to jump. And I'm going to skip this one because I'm running low on time, but what I'll say about it is that we do see little by little people in the district are getting knowledgeable and empowered to help ducks across the street or walking to water, so sometimes we don't have to get involved. And I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth now to talk about Lights Out.
Hello, I'm Elizabeth Hughes. I'm the coordinator of Lights Out DC. Lights Out DC is a program of City Wildlife where an all-volunteer citizen science project that's run continuously for 13 years. We monitor and select areas of downtown DC looking for birds that have collided with windows. We rescue the injured ones. We collect the dead ones. Then we identify problem buildings. We interact with owners and managers to explain the problem and try to get them to make alterations to their buildings to better help birds. And we also conduct educational outreach, and we're a part of a larger network of programs now. There's over 40 in cities across the United States and in Canada. As you all know, birds are in sharp decline across the United States and around the world. How do I make this? Yeah. These are just some lists of human causes of bird collisions, and you'll see that collisions with glass is a huge problem to birds. Just to give you an idea of what a typical Lights Out volunteer does, we only monitor in small areas in downtown DC, but we typically go out between 5:30 and 7:30 during migratory seasons. We're collecting birds, documenting it. We have a database where volunteers enter their data, and at the end of the year, we identify all the birds, double check our data, and then these birds are donated to various organizations that are interested in them, like Natural History Museum here, We've collaborated with the National Zoo as well and other organizations. We photograph the birds. We find these photographs to be very impactful. This is an example from 2021 when we found 738 birds. Obviously, that's not 738, but these have been very impactful. We find all there's commonly affected birds that the majority of Lights Out programs find, and we find those. We've also, we found up to 100 and I think more than 102 species, including 28 species of greatest conservation need as defined by DC's Wildlife Action Plan. And just to give you an example, this is a typical problem for birds. This is the convention center in downtown DC. There's what we call the fly-through condition. The birds don't recognize glass, they fly through. There's an imprint up there of a bird. So this was the convention center, and they worked with us, and they actually applied the bird safe film, and we have recorded an 88% reduction in collisions there. And then after collecting all this data, we were able to work with a coalition of local environmental organizations. And in DC, you know, we worked across racial lines. We're a predominantly white organization. We were able to work with organizations all over the town to band together and to pass, the DC City Council passed bird-friendly legislation. So now, starting in 2024, most new commercial construction or residence larger than 5 units will be required to use bird-friendly glass. So yeah, so a really huge, a huge victory, and it was really based on this this sort of tireless collection of data by wonderful volunteers. So just in conclusion, we want to offer City Wildlife as a model of what wildlife centers can do, because we really, our vision is to create this sort of multi-species sense of community for our residents, this idea that it's a community in which native wildlife, habitat, and ecosystems are valued, protected, and preserved. Thank you.
All right, and we do have a couple of minutes for questions, so our speakers to stay up there for a second, and if you got a question, fire, Sam.
Did you know the guy that jumped over the wall?
No, he just showed up. He lived, he lived in one of the basement apartments that adjoined him.
Well done.
Just showed up.
I had a student who was looking into the wildlife representation centers in Germany, like looking for a study, and she found that there were way more species brought in during the pandemic because people were outside. And I was wondering why you didn't, what happened there, and they also found that there were species brought in which were not in need of help. You know, they were just like,
yes,
I found young raccoons. And they need help. They don't need help, but then they can bring them back to experience this as well in Washington, DC.
I'm not aware that anybody brought us raccoons. I think that we had a little drop in the first year of the pandemic, but you saw that after that it went way up. So because people just, they were staying home literally. That's what caused it.
Yeah.
Animals being brought in that didn't need help.
But I think we have a really good phone system, right? Like, how many calls do we,
It's
someone
a
mentioned it,
lot,
a lot,
yeah.
thousands of calls. So I think we're able to mitigate some of that by like talking to people so that they don't bring in wildlife that does not need to be helped.
So they don't just show up with, because this what happens in Germany.
Well, I mean, some people did, but we also had something set up during the pandemic where nobody could come inside the center. And so they would have to be outside and then they'd call.
But also, as a user of City Wildlife, they also make it really obvious on their website that you're supposed to call first. So I wouldn't even know as a DC resident where to go. I always call and then someone tells me what to do. So I don't know if there's something that could do that. Sorry to answer your question.
No, that's great. Thank you.
That's great.
All right, we got a short question.
Yeah, sure.
how do you guys handle invasive species? Cause I know you mentioned starlings in one of your things. How do you handle invasive species like starlings?
We treat them, yeah.
And then we release them?
Yes.
All right, that brings us to 3 o'clock on the dot. Be everybody back in 30 minutes.
Yeah. They've been over here as well, like, I keep bugging you. I saw that you guys were listed on this program and I was trying to attend more of them, but I just couldn't. I'm still in the downtown office, but I have. Still at the tail end of the pandemic, but I said, well, they're not. Petition to stay away, it's a lot.
Yeah. Give me just a second. I'm trying to figure out what they do about the. Yeah, give me just a second. I'm trying to figure out 10 seconds what they do.
Oh, Lord. I didn't live the hallway on the way. I know. Good job.
Can I get a picture of your presentation? Or is there someone online?
I have no idea. That's what I'm trying to figure out right now. That do more than just turn it off.
Give me 1 second here.
Work on it.
We're already a minute behind.
Oh, I won't, don't worry, I'll catch you up. Need the power session. Everybody's looking for beer 30 after this. No, anyway.
All right, welcome to the second round of human dimensions presentations. My name is Brett Johnson. I'm the conservation manager for the Dallas Parks Department. As we move forward, our first session and second round is by Caitlin Good, and it is public attitudes towards urban wildlife in Metro Atlanta. And your time starts now.
Cool. I'm Caitlin Good. I'm the Urban Wildlife Program Manager for the Georgia Department of Natural Resources. I am not a human dimensions expert. If you have specific questions, I have the papers pulled up on my computer that are in review right now. So I'm happy to dig into those details with you and not try and fake it. But a little bit about how we got here. We're a fairly new program. This was an actual call that we've taken. There's a bunny in my yard, right? Everybody's gotten those phone calls before. I'm like, okay, what's it doing? It's just staring at me. Okay. What would you like me to do? And they're like, come get it. I'm like, we don't do that. Right? That's every state wildlife agency's favorite response. Sorry, we don't do that. But the public's asking, so what do? You are the wildlife agency. Why aren't you helping me with my wildlife? That's the question, right? For all these urban environments, for state wildlife agencies, it's relevancy, right? They don't know who we are. They don't know what we do.
And we don't know who they are or what they do because we're out on WMAs or tractors, planting food plots. So, insert the urban wildlife program. This is what I was handed, these 4 things when I got to start the program. These are my program goals that I was assigned. Improve customer service and constituent satisfaction, increase awareness of our agency and our conservation purpose, foster an appreciation for wildlife in urban communities, and then be the face of WRD in the metro Atlanta area. If y'all ever visit Atlanta and watch the news, you're very likely to see me on it. I have attempted to do 3 different Zoom interviews while I was here. They canceled on me for higher profile things, thank God. But it's like, yes, there's bears in Atlanta. Yes, please just reuse the same interview that you did last time. All right, so we have a brand new program. How do we know if we're doing something well, right? We need to be able to measure our success. Is it the number of bears we take out of Atlanta, or is it the number of programs we do with kids? It's not the number of calls we take. This is not a good measure of success. So this is our dashboard. So we have taken, I looked at it yesterday, 8,500 calls since we started collecting data in August of 2019. And I'm going to reemphasize and do my humble brag again. That's me and like 2 other staff members taking those phone calls. So we do a lot of technical assistance on the phone. I do not like using call volume as a measure of success. They try and make me do it every year during our strategic planning updates. And I'm like, please don't. Okay. Increasing calls is not good. Decreasing calls is not good. It's just a terrible, like, look, this is COVID, right? You're just setting me up for failure, right? If we have another pandemic and my goal is to reduce calls. But so my thought was, let's find out what Atlanta already knows about wildlife. What do they know? What is their tolerance? What changes are they willing to make to accommodate wildlife in their backyards? Apply that knowledge that we learned, do it through education and outreach, and resurvey in 5 years. Now, it's 2023, right? I'm just publishing, so maybe not in 5 years, because that won't be a very good measure of our implementation success, right? So our study area is Atlanta. We surveyed 21 counties in the metro Atlanta area. And just to point out, right, then you guys all experience this too, no matter what variety of wildlife you work in. It's not just the phone calls that you get, right? There's local municipalities that are getting them. Our frontline staff are getting them. First responders, extension agents. So 2,000 calls a year is not what's actually happening in Atlanta, right? So a little bit about the methodology. We surveyed around 1,000 people. We used Qualtrics. We were taking demographic information, and Dr. Pinar put in speed checks to make sure that people were actually reading the questions, not just clicking through them. Our focal species, right? The usual suspects in urban environments. And then some of our survey components. This is, the demographic stuff, interactions. What type of interactions are they having? Are they positive or negative? The frequency of those interactions. And then some risk perception related to wildlife disease. And interestingly enough, we had to put like a little asterisk in there that was like, COVID doesn't count as wildlife disease. I mean, we all know that it does a little bit, but we needed to make sure that people understood that the bats in America are not giving you COVID, right? Self-efficacy, trust in DNR, whether they knew we existed to the first place, and then if they did, do they trust the messaging that we're giving them? Spoiler alert, they don't know who we are. Wildlife value orientations, and then attitudes and emotions towards these individual species. And then preference for increase, decrease, or stay the same, and that was our measure for tolerance. So some sample characteristics, really the only one that I want to point out because it's unique to our survey is we had 54% African-American respondents. And without actually targeting African-American communities, this is just a random sample of Atlanta. And so this is really, really exciting because there's not a lot of surveys that have a high percentage of African-American respondents that weren't actually targeting those communities. So it's cool to see that. So interactions with wildlife. So this is not unusual, right? If you don't live in a house and have a yard, you probably aren't going to be interacting with a lot of these different wildlife species. Types of interactions, lots of intentional interactions, whether you're putting out food for them or you actively go and watch wildlife, planting pollinator gardens, but you know, where there's some of the negative ones, there's percentages of those, but it really wasn't too terrible. It's not like the wildlife are, you know, invading Atlanta and harassing these people, for the most part. So then tolerance for wildlife, so large decrease is that dark orange, large increase is the dark blue. And then gray is neutral, so that's the, you know, anything that is in that blue phase, say the same, small increase or large increase, we would consider tolerance, high tolerance for that wildlife species. They're willing to accommodate more of them into their environment. Usual suspects, possums, coyotes, bobcats, snakes, right? All of those have low tolerances. Not unusual to see. Attitudes towards wildlife. People like turtles in Atlanta. That's awesome. Right? Owls, hummingbirds, right? That's all of those things are good. Yeah, everybody, I mean, how can you not, right? Somebody had that picture of the coral honeysuckle earlier, and I'm just like, we have that. Hummingbirds love it. But this is the coolest thing I think we've come out with is this is the tolerance level based on their zip code. And I'm going to talk about a little bit in the end. I think we need to do some digging into what this like really means, and one, if our sample size is even big enough to really use this as definitively to use our education hours. But it is a really cool map. And I don't know what's going on with this zip code in Fulton County that loves coyotes and hates deer. I'm there for it. I didn't take the survey. And so influences of emotions on tolerance, and this is the thing, and we all know it, right? This is not new information, but if people are scared or annoyed by bats, they have a lower tolerance for them. If they're interested and excited about them, they have a higher tolerance for them. My daughter freaks out when the bats fly away and she can't see them anymore, so she's on this side. But the same thing for everything else. And for snakes and possums. I'm disgusted. I don't know. Okay, so we have snapping turtles in Georgia, and people lose their mind in the month of May because they're moving. We had an entire week of snapping turtle phone calls. It was just like one after another. So maybe that's what it is. All right, so insights and management actions. We talked, the other thing that Dr. Pinar and Mahi did was they took our call data and put it in with the weighted mean tolerance for all the different species. And there was a negative correlation between the number of calls received and the tolerance, which basically means that people are more likely to call if they have a low tolerance for that species. And so the phone calls that we're getting about these high conflict species, are they actually high conflict species? Or do people just dislike them that strongly? So that's interesting, and hopefully we can do something with that. So these management steps, I'm big on whenever we're doing research. Okay, what are we actually going to use this for? Because it's fun. I love it. I will go out with Summer any day and capture coyotes, but we have to be able to do something with it afterwards. So this targeted marketing and outreach in these communities based on their zip codes, and their tolerance levels, and reinforcing these positive emotions. So we have lots of positive emotions about wildlife in Atlanta, in general, right? Probably overall, mostly positive things. Let's reinforce that, because as you increase that tolerance level in those positive realms, you're going to do more good for everything else that's associated with them too. And then last but not least, so the self-efficacy that came out of this is the more frequent interactions people had, the more they felt comfortable taking care of things themselves. So teaching people how to take care of themselves had a higher tolerance. So if you know how to exclude a coyote from denning underneath your shed, your tolerance level for them is gonna go up, right? That makes sense. So how do we create outreach materials or instruction videos to empower residents to mitigate that conflict themselves? And that's, I tell my team the whole time, we're giving people the tools to fix it themselves. We can't go out there and fix everything for them. We have to be able to give them the tools to fix them themselves. The goal of our program is to educate ourselves out of a job. We know that's not ever going to happen, but it's a nice goal, right? I have it on my whiteboard in my office. But with that, I'll take any questions. Thank you to the survey reviewers and respondents. If anybody had that on their bingo card, you win double deer through a fence. But I know I've got time, so.
Oh, no, you're good.
Yeah.
You're good on time for questions, so, all right.
So I was just curious, do you have a traditional telephone number or are you like a 311 call?
No, oh God, no. I hope we never go that route, but no, so we have a traditional phone number. We have multiple phone numbers. Because my program overlaps with 2 different game management region offices. The calls go to them, and then they see that it's in Atlanta County and they don't try to help the person and they page it out to us. Or we have a main line at my office, and it's the same thing. As soon as they find out that it's an urban county, they're like, oh, the urban program can take care of this, and they send it to us. But we do have a 1-800 number that is like our ranger hotline, for after hour calls, and those get paged out to us as well.
Do you only staff that answers it, or do you also have volunteers that answer it?
Well, interestingly enough, we just started an internship program and the interns take the weekend phone calls now. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so with the snapping turtle thing, that was interesting to me, so.
Yeah.
Clearly, there's potential for perceptions to shift by the season.
Yes.
Do you think there's a necessity to do these types of surveys multiple times a year? I know that sounds like a lot.
Yeah.
But, and if so, like, would you also need to adapt your mitigation strategies and outreach accordingly?
Yes, absolutely. To that second question, I don't know that I can sell my leadership on doing this survey like for every season. I would love to do this survey again in November when everybody's tired of deer. So we can be like, look, people actually don't like deer. But that we can absolutely do where we do that, right? I've got my like fawn Facebook posts like geared up and ready to go, but I would love to do more Facebook. Like Facebook's super creepy for those of you that don't already know that. And they know where you are, where you live, and you can target that zip code where you identify and you just get blown up with, stop touching the fawn Facebook posts, right? Or it's okay, turtles are moving through the area this time of year, Facebook posts, you just see our post over and over again. So hopefully that's something that we can start doing more of.
You might have mentioned this, but how do you actually distribute the survey to community members?
So it's through Qualtrics, and I don't know. Voodoo Magic. That's the part that I stay out of.
Like, do people have to opt in, or is it like posted somewhere, or?
So it was, we only did the survey with the number of people that we needed to do the survey. We didn't get any more than that. And we stratified it amongst counties too, so we got a spatial representation of Atlanta.
Is your hope with the like positive views on certain species that if you start getting increased calls that you can then, maybe you had said this and I missed it, that you can then target those cities or areas or council or for ordinances on like, hey, like you're getting a lot of calls about deer, but
yes,
the community really likes deer, so
yes, there's just, I mean, for those that have like established urban programs already in your cities, you know that there's just an exponential amount of stuff that you can do. And so this is the first step, right? Figuring out what is already happening. And then, but yes, targeting those communities, going to city council meetings, this is what your constituents, how do they feel about wildlife, and working with them to accommodate those views.
So rather than a question about the human dimensions, more about your program. Do you ever use this data to justify the growth?
Yes, absolutely. That's the only reason I started taking data. I mean, data is important other reasons, but like I can't justify my existence without this information. And I throw it at my senior leadership all the time.
What's the reception?
Oh, we're going to Savannah and Augusta next. I already have positions that are ready. I don't know if anybody's looking for a job. So this late this summer, Shane can attest that I'm wonderful to work for.
Good.
I get a couple more in.
Yes, ma'am.
About how many calls did you say you got a day?
A day, I don't have that. We get around 2,000 calls a year. Math, students. But yeah, so it varies, right? We'll go in the winter. I have my technicians working on other projects because the calls drop off, right? Because wildlife aren't moving as much, so they do other things during the winter that's more proactive stuff. But yeah, it just varies. Like Monday, I think we got 40 phone calls. And there's 2 people working right now because I'm here. And they were blown up. I was just seeing my pages go through my phone. I was like, oh, I'm sorry.
I mean, I'm in San Antonio, so we have about 2.5 million there, and
Yeah.
I get like maybe 2 calls a day.
Oh,
So, and I have a regular phone number, so I
Yeah.
was just wondering if maybe.
oh, yeah.
Our 311 gets a lot, and then it comes from over sometimes, that seems like it makes sense to me.
But to that end, I would turn around and ask, how long have you been established there now?
Well, 28 years, but still, what, I've done a good job, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
All right, one more question.
Yes.
I'm curious, do you work at all with any wildlife rehabilitation
Yeah.
facilities in the area to help diffuse some of that?
Yeah, so we actually are, we have a loose working group in Atlanta, that they're a part of, because they're an essential part of the conversation, right? Because they're doing a lot of that frontline customer service education. And so the big one we work with is Chattahoochee Chattahoochee Nature Center, Chattahoochee National Recreation Area is also there, but so, and we give them our fact sheets to give out to the public. We bring them stuff, we bring them deer for their critters. So we have a really good relationship with several rehabs.
And with that. As we continue on in human dimensions, we have Seante Bass. We'll be going over perceptions and attitudes towards urban wildlife conflict and the urban landscape review. And start.
Hello, everyone. I am Sayantani, and I'm coming from Poland, from a beautiful city of Krakow. So yes, do ask questions because I'm coming all the way from Poland to attend the conference. Yes, right. If you have been through the session, you have seen, for example, a lot of people were talking about perception, about attitudes, and a lot of studies they have done. So these are the 2 terms that have been coming quite often. And I wanted to start by defining what are the 2 terms. Not necessarily I am a social scientist or a psychologist, so I'll try to explain a bit and then define how exactly my study was conducted. So I'll take the definition of Bennett, who defined perception as the way an individual understands, interprets its environment. And I'll give you an example, a real life example. I think everybody, all through your life, you have heard or you have seen or experienced that smoking is injurious to health, right? So in general, you will have this perception of smoking not being good. So you'll have a negative perception of smoking in general, but there can be some people who might not think so. So for that reason, I have put this picture. For example, you can think yes, and some people might think even no. So that is a general perception of what you think based on either your personal experience, what others have said, or even just advertisement that you have seen, which can make your perception about certain things. When I talk about attitude, it's more of a decision. So based on your perception, what you do exactly. So again, coming back to the smoking example, so because if you have a negative perception, your attitude towards smoking can be, you don't smoke. Or even if you think that smoking is injurious, you still do smoke out of many reasons. And I don't want to get into that. So it's not necessary that a certain perception will have the same kind of attitude towards that. And that's why it's very important that you understand the difference between perception and attitude when you incorporate social science and natural sciences, especially in an urban landscape. So as I mentioned, there are three significant factors that influence attitude towards anything, which is affect, that you have a feeling of, a cognition, a thought, and a behavior. So what you exactly do. And taking a theoretical model, you have certain kind of awareness, perception, which might shape your attitude in a positive or a negative way, which gives right to the intention of your behavior, and finally, your actual behavior towards that thing. And this was the general idea I wanted to introduce, and that's it. The philosophy stops here, and I'll start continuing with what I did exactly. So the objective of this, conducting this review, which is a chapter of my PhD, was to understand how was the global trend. So how many studies have included a perception or attitude to understand human-wildlife conflict in an urban landscape. So the main idea was to see spatially as well as a temporal aspect. The second objective was to determine if what are the conflictual species, so which species did people think are in conflictual with, as well as which study areas. And the final one was to recognize what kind of conflicts people thought they have with wildlife in the city, and longitudinal studies. And what I mean by longitudinal studies, as one of, I think, the last time one of the questions was raised, is whether we should do repetitive studies or not. So whether we should see there has been a change, a shift in perception or attitude, especially when you are thinking of urban landscape, which is very volatile. It's very changing, rapidly changing. So you need to have these kind of studies as well. So I wanted to see how many studies also highlighted or did studies which were longitudinal in nature. For the inclusion criteria, first, I included only questionnaires, survey, focus group interviews. So any studies that had these kind of perspective, attitude studies, and it can be various form. It can be qualitative, it can be quantitative as well. Of course, it has to involve wild animals. It should be conducted in an urban landscape. And I was not just restricted into urban landscape. I also included studies which might have compared urban or rural. So I don't want to exclude those studies, or urban suburban regions. However, if it was only suburban or it was only protected areas, those studies were excluded. And of course, a human and wildlife conflict. So it has to do something with conflict studies. Unfortunately, I had to limit the studies in just English publications, as well as till 2021. Yeah, it's a big graph. It's a Prisma graph, generally recommended for doing systematic reviews these days. But the most important thing was the number of studies that I found, which is what you have to remember. It's 124 articles, which kind of fit in whatever I was looking towards conducting this review for. So the first objective was to see spatial and the temporal trend. On the left, you can see the spatial trend. So people from the States, they should be very happy because there have been a number of studies that had been conducted. So great job. Also from Canada, from Australia, and you can see not a lot of studies from Europe, a few bit from Africa, a bit more towards China and India as well. So more or less the study area I tried to mark. However, I wanted to mention that some of the studies were even cross-country. So sometimes even one study can have multiple regions. So I had to mark them as well. And regarding the temporal trend, yes, which is pretty common. If you do any reviews, you'll see in the last decade, there has been a huge rise in the number of publications, and even perception studies were not an exception. So you can see this drastic change, drastic rise, which is great. I just hope that it's more spatially as well as distributed, because we are growing, the urban areas are growing and conflicts are rising. So it's important that people recognize it. I wanted to map the taxonomy. So you can see that mammal was the most studied taxa, which is obvious because people feel more conflictual when you see a large wildlife in general. But you can see some kind of bird studies also in Europe, in Africa and South America. So but it was majorly dominated by mammal taxa. A few here and there of amphibian, reptile, insect, but just to give an overview of how it looked. I also wanted to have this comparison over the trophic level as well. So in terms of dietary intake, so we categorized the different species most as we could into different kind of, as well as I have seen the previous figure, the taxa as well, but also the trophic level as well. So, and you can see that majority, there was no direct interrelation between them. You can find a lot of carnivores, herbivores, and omnivores as well. We tried to identify if there was a pattern. There wasn't any much. It was more or less distributed equally. Of course, because most of the studies were conducted in the US, you see a lot of coyotes, but also other type of species such as gray wolves, brown bear, black bear, more or less everything here and there. But generally, what are the species that people thought they have conflict with in urban areas? More or less the picture depicted here. Okay, and the final ones. The final objective was, again, if I remind you, was to identify if people thought of or people commented on certain kind of conflicts they thought they had or they encountered with. Mostly they were damages, danger for life, pests, diseases, and sometimes even on certain articles, they were not explicitly mentioned. We had to go through the discussion to text mine them to find if people say, oh yeah, I thought that, you know, raccoon might attack, or I might think that, you know, wild boar is dangerous, for example. It's just scary, for example. So sometimes we even had to text mine. But the good part is we even found, even though we didn't intentionally look for this, but we really found a lot of aspects which focused on coexistence. So for example, they said like, yeah, even though I had an attack and everything, but I realized, you know, there is this problem that we are encroaching the landscape of wildlife. So we have to, for some reason, be adjusting, be tolerating, or in some way we have to accept them into our habitat as well. So even though I wasn't exclusively looking for coexistence, but I did manage and I did try to identify them and map them. And this is quite nice because that's the aim, right? You want to coexist with wildlife and we want to try to find how and where exactly you can go. So this was a great finding. And now the million-dollar questions. How many studies did incorporate longitudinal research? For example, this long-term research repetition. 7. So based on the search criteria, only 7 articles out of the 124 research articles did mention of anything that had to do with long-term research, which is sad because I see Seth here and he mentioned in one of his articles that there is this need for conducting longitudinal research, long-term research as well. However, if we want to see where those studies were conducted, mostly again the US, so good job. And mostly involving black bear, deer, wild boar, and gray wolves, which is good. Now the conclusion. So what can we conclude? Yes, there is a geographical bias. We see a huge, which doesn't mean that other regions are not urban. It doesn't mean that there's not enough wildlife, which we have huge. In Poland, we have huge number of wildlife, urban areas. So yes, we need to conduct more on certain regions as well. The lack of longitudinal studies. Yes, I agree to the fact that it's time consuming. It requires a lot of money, investment of people, but it's important. Because without this longitudinal or temporal effect, what we have is only snapshots of human-wildlife conflict without understanding whether it's aggravating, whether it's diminishing, whether people are becoming tolerant, accepting, they are not. We don't know this shift. So that's why it's so important. Yes, urban residents, nearly we are going to be almost 70% of the people are going to be residing in urban areas by 2050. That's what they say. So yes, which means they are a resource. So you have to incorporate citizens or different kind of stakeholders into this planning and policy making, involving them in research so that they have a say. You identify which regions are the hotspots. Which regions are more prone to this conflict areas. So you can propagate or try to minimize conflicts in some way or the other. And finally, as I said before, it's not just important to know perception of certain wildlife, but also what is your attitude towards it. So for example, if somebody asks, do you like a deer? What do you think about deer? You might just say, yes, it's fine, it's good, it's cute. They're nice to look at. But when you ask certain questions like, do you want to conserve deer in and around your residential area? They might just say no, because they cause damage to your backyard. So perception of and attitude towards certain things should go hand in hand. And with that, I like to thank the funders of the two Polish national grants, NCN and NAWA. Here's the paper. If you want to have a look, it's published very recently. So yeah, if you just want to have a look, if you want to talk about anything, thank you so much.
We're doing good on time. We have time for questions, so pop up the hands, let's go.
With studies that you want to like happen through time, do you think there's an effort that should be made on like citizen science in trying to keep that citizen science base up to keep those studies going?
Yes, it's very important. And I think that's the key thing that at least in Poland, they are incorporating citizen science. They're having this website where citizens can upload posts where they are observing certain wildlife, what they think about certain wildlife. In Poland, I know they are doing something like that. And that's a database, right? So that can be used even 10 years down the line when it's more important to study what was. And we might be sitting in 2033 thinking what was in 2023. And it's going to be really difficult because I published a paper, I think a year back, where I did exactly that. So I compared 2010 and 2020. And I just can't tell you how many conflicts and the change in the conflictual species that have come up in a decade. So that's a really great database if countries can do that.
What metric did you use to filter out whether the paper was an urban, suburban?
We had to go through the methodology. So we were using the software called Ryan, which is great if you want to do systematic review, because there can be 2-3 people who are selecting independently. So we had this option, we were given this criteria, and there were 2-3 people who are doing it independently. So if you see through the methodology, through the study area, that they were considered urban, city, town, these terms were mentioned, and we have this in a table format in the paper. If those were mentioned, that were included. But of course, then later, we again sat when we had to go through the selected papers, we again sat together to determine whether they had any bias or not.
So you just went off what the author considered their studies?
Yes, unfortunately, yes. So it was limited to what wordings the manuscript has used.
Okay, and do you think sorry, someone else asked a question.
No,
We're good on time, folks. Sam, yeah, I know you're gonna have something.
Well, I am curious. So on your paper studies, there's a lot about the fallacy of the survey, that the people already interested in the subject are going to complete the survey. Did you find that any of the researchers incentivized surveys? So sort of gave some sort of financial contribution, whatever might be the completion of those surveys?
Yes, this is true. And I think yesterday I was talking to someone about different kind of biases that is there in questionnaire survey. Yes, there will be biases if money is involved. There's also another bias, which is you want to look good of protecting or conserving wildlife when it's face to face. So you're like, yeah, I really like them. Yeah, they're nice, they're cool. We should. So that's the thing when you do face to face survey. When it's online, anonymous, it can be completely different. So yes, that's there. And that's one of the major bias of questionnaire survey. But this is a kind of methodology that people use. Certain times, that's why it's important to probably back up with stakeholders interview as well. So certain very selective 10, 15, 20 people who really have idea when you want to plan any mitigation measures, when you want to invest certain amount of money for the protecting of the place in general. That's what I can say.
You can keep, Dan going.
Oh, okay, great.
You can keep talking, we've got.
Oh,
a couple
okay.
minutes.
Yes.
Any more questions? Anybody?
Maybe you can follow up, people saying something. So-
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so if you went off of what the authors said as being their location, do you think that that affected the different species that came up as well as how many got reported over time, like you showed the graph? Like you didn't use a specific metric, like population growth.
No, because we tried to look for categorizing a population density. Like if you want to categorize, okay, I will only select studies which has certain population as well as density to be as cities, let's say, and then include those not based on the author's point of view. That gave us a lot of difficulty because we have the US Census data which classifies US cities very differently than what we have as the UN one, which does for Europe, let's say in general. There's also division because in a country like Poland, which is of very low density and cities are very small, but they are still cities, considered to be cities. So it was difficult to use one metric for global studies, let's say. So that's why we had to go, if they had termed it as a city urban or something like that. So that was the bias we couldn't overcome in that respect. It would be nice, but I think with the disparity, I mean, if you go for any Asian countries, the density would be really high, right? So none of the cities in Poland will be considered cities in India. Thank you.
Very good.
Perfect on time. So our 410 session is Micaiah Carver McGinn. And with negative emotions, predict risk perceptions towards wildlife disease. Which apparently what's on the-
Oh, yeah, we've got a few differences today. Thank you. Thank you guys all for joining us today. I know it's kind of the last bit of the day, so I appreciate you all who can make it. My name is Micaiah Carver McGinn. Disclaimer, this is not my research. These are not my slides. I am presenting for a colleague. So please bear with me. I will provide her contact information at the end. I will attempt to answer any questions you may have, but this is probably not going to be the most refined talk that you've heard today. All right. So before I begin, I do want to mention that collaborators of this research include many entities in North Carolina, including North Carolina State University and the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. Hannah here at the top is the primary researcher on this, this study. I'm just a PhD student that knows her. So that's where we're at here. I will provide her contact information later. So jumping right in, just take a moment to consider how you feel as you take in each of these photos. Do they bring up any sort of emotional response or maybe a memory that you might have had in the past? And what about now? Consciously or not, a lot of our opinions surrounding wildlife depend on emotional responses, both positive and negative. People often respond emotionally rather than analytically, as emotion-based reactions are the fastest unconscious drivers of human decisions. It's important to understand what people feel in order to fully understand management preferences of wildlife. The concept of emotion often denotes two constructs, states and traits. An emotional state refers to temporary feelings such as being excited to see a deer or wildlife while you're on a jog in the woods, while an emotional trait could be a general disposition for one to fear snakes, right? So emotional dispositions are always present, even if they're not active and they're relatively stable. Research on emotions toward wildlife have primarily focused on emotional dispositions as they're central to daily human experience. Emotional dispositions are critical to wildlife to assign meaning to them and can influence mental processes such as perceptions and decision-making. Essentially, emotions reflect our most basic reactions to wildlife. Emotional reactions toward wildlife can be both positive or negative and have effects on a given population. Emotions such as fear or anger can generate support against the presence of a given species, while in contrast, positive emotions can promote conservation for another species. Previous research has found that anger, obviously a negative emotion, and sympathy, a more positive emotion, towards wolves actually explain a considerable amount of the variance in respondents' acceptability of lethal wolf management. Positive emotional dispositions have also been shown to increase support for wolf recovery. This relationship between human emotions and management support can have an effect on the presence, absence, or recovery of a wildlife population. However, research has not yet looked to see if these findings expand beyond predatory species or others that are traditionally seen as scary to the public. This leaves us several questions, namely the need to explore how emotions affect management acceptance for a wider selection of non-predator species, such as the white-tailed deer. It's also important to address what role emotions will play in predicting management acceptance when other variables are considered. This is especially important for factors such as gender or previously experienced deer damage, which have both been suggested to influence management acceptance in previous studies. So for this study, we sought to understand what relationship, if any, exists between emotions and white-tailed deer management. We hypothesized that negative emotions toward deer would predict higher acceptance for lethal management options, and positive emotions toward deer would predict lower acceptance for lethal management strategies. We also sought to understand what other factors predict management acceptance for white-tailed deer, specifically along an urban to rural scale. This would allow us to understand how management acceptance might change as land continually becomes more urbanized. They predicted that demographics such as gender that have previously played a role in management acceptance would be important predictors of management acceptance. We also hypothesized that lethal management would be more acceptable for residents who experienced property damage due to deer or deer vehicle collisions, as this is in line with studies from other research. So to understand how emotions affect acceptance for deer, we surveyed residents in Durham County in North Carolina. Residents were classified as urban, suburban, or rural based on zoning definitions in Durham County, and 2,500 people were randomly selected from each strata. We used a mailed questionnaire to reach residents using 4 separate contacts, and we ultimately received 977 completed and usable responses. For those not really familiar with North Carolina, this is Durham County. It is where Duke is housed. This here is a map showing our city area and the urban, suburban, and rural strata from which the sample was selected. To assess emotional reactions, we asked participants to rank the extent to which a list of emotions would reflect how they would feel if they saw a deer on their property. We assessed positive emotions such as curiosity, surprise, and excitement, and negative emotions such as fear, sadness, and anger as a grouped variable after factor analysis. The responses from calm, due to its more neutral nature, didn't fit into either of these categories, and so it was disregarded from the analysis. To measure management acceptance, participants indicated their level of acceptance for each strategy separately on a 5-point scale from very unacceptable to very acceptable. And here are the different management strategies that they were presented with. So using factor analysis, we were able to group all management strategies into 3 more general groupings: hunting, which included archery and firearm; lethal management by professionals, which included euthanasia and trained sharpshooters; and then passive management, which included no interference or educating the public about living responsibly with deer. We built 3 regression models. I know this is busy. I will dive into it graphically momentarily. We built 3 regression models using the following independent variables. We had resident locations, so if they were in urban, suburban, or rural areas; emotional response, the effect of that emotional response, so how do they generally feel about deer on a scale of very negative to very positive; age, level of education, gender, hunter status, and if they previously experienced deer damage. And then acceptance of management strategies was the dependent variable. Across all three models, the main takeaways are that emotions are the strongest predictors of management acceptance. Positive emotions decrease support for lethal management, both hunting and lethal professionals, and increase support for passive management. The opposite trend exists for negative emotions. Gender and political affiliation were also influential predictors of management acceptance across the models, with women being less accepting of lethal management options and more accepting of the passive management options. The self-identified political affiliation variable predicted decreased support for lethal management for more liberal respondents, with the opposite being true for more conservative respondents. So visualizing these results, so you can see that the support for hunting decreased as residents reported higher positive emotional ties to the deer in their area. The more positive people felt toward their local deer, the less likely they were to accept hunting as a management strategy. Going into the second management option, this trend was the same for lethal management by professionals for those who had positive feelings towards deer. We can see that support for lethal management decreased as residents reported higher positive emotional ties to the deer in their area, while on the other hand, negative reported emotions, as those increased, so did the support for lethal management by professionals. When we look at the acceptance of passive management strategies, though, this trend was the opposite to those found in the other two options. Negative emotions towards deer decreased support for passive management options, and residents who reported positive emotions toward the deer population had higher acceptance for passive management. It is important to note that negative emotions are less common than positive emotions when it comes to deer, but both are influential factors when it comes to management acceptance. Overall, people feel fairly neutral about deer, with positive emotions averaging at 4.02 on an 8-point scale. Negative emotions were much lower on average at 1.67, but despite less people having negative emotional relations to deer, they are still important to consider because of the management acceptance implications. So overall, both negative and positive emotions are the most important predictors of the acceptance if people feel, even regardless of if people feel neutrally about deer. So diving into the discussion, the acceptance of management strategies is strongly influenced by emotions, which are stronger predictors of the acceptance of management strategies than demographics and previous deer-caused damage. Prior research has shown that lethal management appears to be more acceptable when deer densities are high enough to cause major damage both to property or through deer vehicle collisions. Despite that, the emotional response associated with deer was a stronger predictor completely independent of the damage variable. So the question remains, why is this the case? The predicting strength that emotions have on wildlife management acceptance may be explained using a more cultural context, where people integrate individual and collective experiences, perceptions, and traditions to construct an emotional response. Using this lens, it's understood that emotions are built on long-standing personal and cultural connections to wildlife that may extend beyond individual experience, such as hitting a car with your vehicle, or individual characteristics such as gender, to influence management acceptance and beliefs about wildlife. In this view, it's understood that human emotions associated with wildlife have evolved over time and continue to be gradually built and rooted in our societies all over the world. It may be important to seek answers about emotional drivers related to wildlife on a wider societal scope. Previous research has shown that negative emotions are important for management acceptance for predator species like wolves, but this has not yet been shown for other species such as deer. The fact that negative emotions still drive management acceptance, even when the animal is relatively benign, shows that this can be applied to wildlife outside of the realm of species that traditionally harm or hurt livestock or people. Where is this negative emotion coming from? Well, past research findings have suggested that the acceptance of management for large carnivore species is shaped by similar psychological processes, resulting in similar emotional responses. Our results suggest that this expands beyond carnivores and that the underlying psychological processes may be shaped similarly for a broader range of wildlife. Previous research also has found that women were less accepting than men of lethal management, often suggesting emotional connections and attitudes to influence this difference in acceptance. While we did find a significant difference in emotions between men and women, our research suggests that gender appears to drive management acceptance independently from emotions. Future research is needed to determine if there is an interaction between gender and emotions, or if there are other attributes within gender that are driving this difference in acceptance. With the current social climate, it appears that every issue is becoming more polarized, with political affiliation creating a tribal response when considering decision-making. On the other hand, this polarization may have always been lurking under the surface, and we are just beginning to look at the role politics plays in wildlife management. Recent work has suggested that any perceived links between wildlife management issues and political ideology may exacerbate existing community disagreements, regardless of emotion. And due to this, it's important to understand what role political affiliation plays in wildlife management acceptance, with the potential to use political data to predict management support across the state. And stepping away from predicting management acceptance for a moment, I want to acknowledge that there appears to be an alignment between current management practices and what residents want, particularly in Durham County, with significant differences in mean acceptance for management between rural and suburban and urban sites. Basically, where someone lives isn't an obvious significant predictor for acceptance in our models. But there are significant differences in the means, with rural respondents having higher acceptance levels for hunting, and then suburban and urban respondents having higher acceptance for passive management. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time. I'd be happy to attempt to answer any questions. Otherwise, Hannah, this is her contact information, would 100% be the best point of contact for anything beyond, well, really anything. Any questions? Thank you.
Oh, nobody wants to answer any questions, because you did it perfect.
Oh,
Two minute mark.
Well, you know, of that, like, I think it was roughly 1,000 responses that you got. Was it an even mix of suburban, urban and rural, or was there disproportionate responses from one area?
That's a fabulous question, and one I do not answer to. I'm sorry. Anyone else? I'm sorry, guys. I wish I could be more help. I'm just not the person.
Oh, definitely fascinating. Now I gotta figure out how to fill in about 5 minutes worth of time.
Sorry about that.
No problem. No, it's good. It was an excellent presentation, and
So, I like that. He's great. I do with him on my project. Yeah, I know.
I think we're technically supposed to wait till 4:30.
So it's awesome. Right? I've already been.
For those listening online, we'll be starting in about 4 minutes. Home stretch. We all feel honored having the last session. You look very excited.
You gotta run against her.
Oh. Well, you already know, we'll be watching the time very carefully.
I know, I've observed that, very, very.
All right, well, we waited just a couple of seconds, and then we got the guys from Mississippi, Mr. Guy in the green shirt over here, where are you from? Norton. What you do?
Wildlife.
Wildlife control? The guy from Parks and Wildlife that likes to talk over there. What's your name? What do you do?
Me?
Yeah. Oh, I've been on in time for 3 months.
Okay, yeah, Sam Keishnick, Urban Wildlife Lab. That was cool.
Okay.
But I am very interested about the concept of getting survey data.
Yes.
You know, that's that alone, and there's been a lot of research on the concept of surveys. Like how in the world do we get true human perception of wildlife? You know, and our best tool is the survey, but there's such fallacy in it. There's so many biases. So I've heard of other people that actually incentivize it. Like if you fill out this, you get a $10 Starbucks cup or whatever. But nonetheless, and if you do it in person, they see the logo.
Yeah. That cool conversation. Is it Lindsay?
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember. Want to introduce yourself real quick? Since you...
Okay. I'm Lindsay White over the Humane Society of the United States and our Wild Neighbors program. So we create a lot of resources to help communities, animal care control officers, and other people who take calls about wildlife. We have a lot of resources on that and trainings. Wildneighbors.org. You want to see that?
All right, I've got probably time for one more. If you've talked to me, but the individual from Albuquerque, why don't you introduce yourself?
My name is Virginia Thompson. I'm the city of Albuquerque's urban wildlife ecologist, and I basically am the wildlife department of the city of Albuquerque.
There you go.
Yes, I do said very cool.
Almost there. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just gonna start this up.
I just had a caller that wants to call back regarding.
Yep.
I get 311 call as part of my.
And the new biologist for Indiana, why don't you introduce yourself real quick?
I'm Jessica Merkley. I am the North Region Urban Wildlife Biologist for the state of Indiana, but that just means that the other position's gone now, so I'm the only urban biologist in the state of Indiana right now.
Heading up the program. Good.
Heading up. We're gonna get started. Just wanted to say, I was trying to get some people that I've talked to and all, just also represent y'all. Y'all are literally from all over the country. So with that in mind, let's get our last session in place. We got Megan Bonner. Stories of wildlife in our cities, listening to our municipalities. I'm interested. This and start.
All right. Hi, everyone. Last session of the day. Thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate it. So my name is Megan Bona. I'm an undergrad going into my senior year at Michigan State University. And this past summer, I had the lovely opportunity to work with Dr. Adam Ronke with Mississippi State University's extension program, and I was an apprentice working with him, the wildlife coordinator, and gave me the opportunity to work on this project where we conducted focus groups with the Jackson Metro municipality officials. And the purpose of conducting these focus groups was really just to extract the attitudes and perceptions and experiences of each of these municipality individuals and departments of the wildlife in the region, whether it was suburban or rural or urban, and how that differed from place to place. So picture to the right there, that's me and some participants at one of the focus groups. And ultimately, the purpose was, how can we as MSU Extension help these people better understand and better put out more public service for wildlife needs? And that includes wildlife management for the municipalities, challenges, different concerns that they have, as well as opportunities and positive things that want to be explored more, trying to sway a little bit away from the negative stuff because it's kind of what tends to come out. And then human-wildlife interaction and conflict. So the way we developed our question route was just simply asking ourselves, what do we want to know? What information do we want to gather from these people? And first thing would be the priority ranking of wildlife issues kind of amongst themselves. So what's the most important or most prominent wildlife issue in that municipality, that department, and then what sort of falls to the bottom. Next would be the priority of wildlife in general with all the other tasks that a municipality department has to deal with, which is immense. And we just want to see where wildlife ranks in order of all of those things. Again, those challenges and opportunities, really trying to see what positive things we can get out. And then the resources that already exist for these people to deal with different wildlife concerns and how they're using them. And then the resources that don't yet exist that they kind of wish they had, and how maybe what we can provide them in terms of that. So next, very wordy slide, but this is our question route here. And the first question was honestly the most important and telling to me, was asking these people, in your own words, how do you define wildlife? Because asking that question to a room like this is, you'll pretty much get similar answers, but when you're talking to government officials, you don't know what you're going to get. And that's pretty telling for how they're going to answer the rest of the questions in relation to wildlife. So that was a cool thing to start with. And then after that, being as non-leading as we can, and again, encouraging positive responses as well as the negative responses. We've got those challenges and opportunities again. We've got the resources that are already available, and then barriers to accessing those already existing resources, as well as just barriers to completing daily wildlife related duties in general. And then that resource wish list that I mentioned. So our methodology for targeting participants and the people that we wanted in each of these focus groups kind of boiled down to what departments and individuals interact with wildlife on a day-to-day basis in their daily duties. And first and probably most obvious answer is animal control, but we ended up realizing that the police are also very involved with animal control due to that lack of staffing and lack of funding. So if an ACO can't get out there to deal with a wildlife issue, a lot of times police have to do that. So we'll get into that a little bit more. And then Parks and Rec, City Planning, and Public Works were the other three. So here's our little focus group setup. That's me up the top of head of the table there. I facilitated them, and around the table would be the municipal participants from the respective departments. We had audio recorders up on the table so as to record all of the dialogue and be able to send it later to a transcription service, have it transcribed. So we have that physical copy that we can then quote and code and start some qualitative analysis. At the front there, you'll see our assistant facilitators table, and they were taking observer notes. And this is really important because we wanted to not only capture the dialogue and the words, but also the visual cues and attitudes that were coming from these people, whether it was from a question we asked or a reaction to something another participant said. That was pretty valuable to us. And then the assistant facilitators also helped us fill out the flip charts that you kind of see around the room there. And I'm going to get into that next. So to the left there, you'll see that wildlife challenges and opportunities flip chart filled out by an assistant facilitator. And when we asked this question, the reason we had that assistant put them up in the respective departments was so we can kind of just have a visual for everyone to remember what do we want to come back to as the questions progress. And then for us later, when we're coding and analyzing all this data, like what stuck out, what was the first thing that these people said in, short language. Then to the right is something we developed called the parking lot, which is kind of for the more talkative person who tends to get ahead of us and go to further questions that we're not quite ready yet for. And because we really wanted each question to have its own concise time and answer and not kind of stray away. So if someone kind of went ahead of us, something we were going to talk about later, we'd put it up there so as not to forget, be able to come back to it, make sure everyone feels heard. Then to the left here, I know you can't read them, but there's some words on those sticky notes. And when we asked the questions, what resources do you have and what barriers exist to these resources, before answering out loud, we asked them to just write their answer on a sticky note. And this was for the less expressive and less talkative person in the room, so as not to get spoken over. If someone else starts talking, they feel that they can't or they don't want to contribute anymore. That kind of forced everyone to give us something. And that was really valuable in the coding process as well. And then to the right is the resource wish list. Again, filled out, they gave us verbal answers and an assistant facilitator wrote up the buzzwords there. So we analyzed all of these transcripts with semantic qualitative analysis, which essentially the meat of it is taking out that pure dialogue and trying to see what the emotions we can see and the context and the experiences from just the pure language there. So the start of that is you review your initial research questions. What do we want to know? And then we break it into transcripts for open coding. And at this point, we had 2 sets of eyes, myself and the next intern, who's this summer's intern, looking at this. And that's just so we make sure we don't miss anything and we can end up comparing with one another. Then we move into open coding, which is just simply breaking up the data into codes that make sense together, that have similar context, similar attitudes, and kind of buzzwords in a way. Then you move into axial coding, which differs from open coding in the way that this is when you start to categorize those open codes a little bit. So a category can be created based on an existing open code, or you can create a new category that kind of encompasses multiple codes, which you'll see in a bit. And then we continue comparing the codes. This is when the 2 of us would come together, see what we both have, see what we're missing, catch something maybe she had that I didn't, or vice versa. And after that, we can define some central ideas and core categories, things that we see super repetitively. And then you do it all again. You reread and you recode and make sure you haven't missed anything. So our demographic results, as you might notice, there was no public works departments present at any of the focus groups. And we assume that this is because of the water crisis that was occurring in Jackson, Mississippi at the time. So understandable. But what really excited me is that we wanted to reach out to a variety of officials from a variety of different backgrounds and identities. And we seem to have a pretty decent variety in different races and ethnicities and gender and age amongst all our officials. So that was super exciting to me. Next year, wordy slide, I'll give you what you need to know. But mostly a lot of that coding is like spent just highlighting on a sheet of paper buzzwords. And so what you can see is Ridgeland and Pearl here are more suburban municipalities, and Jackson is the city center, so it's super urban. And so in the suburban municipalities, we had a lot of mention of deer that was super repetitive because that's where they're roaming, as well as geese and ducks dirtying community centers and public lands. And then something across all 3 of them was raccoons, whether it's trash infestation, civilians being nervous about disease, and just raccoons invading like occupied homes. So that was mentioned pretty frequently. And then here's the opportunities. Hopefully the positive things that we were trying to get out. And so for Pearl, the ACO gets tons of calls asking her to remove this nuisance wildlife and relocate an animal, which a lot of times, depending on the animal and the location, goes beyond her legal duties and abilities. So an opportunity there is that we want to find a way to better inform the public on when they should or shouldn't call an animal control officer, and also how the ACO should direct their calls if they do receive a call that's not really hers. Something super excited was that Ridgeland wanted more corridors and added green spaces, and you can see there right over the highway, they're starting to get that going there, which is super positive. And then Jackson, as I'll continue to mention, has a lot of abandoned homes where vegetation succession is starting to take place. And they're kind of struggling dealing with that, whether it's the wildlife taking over those residencies and then spreading into occupied neighbors. So they want more tools to help deal with when and how to let vegetation succession take place. Next, the barriers and missing resources for Pearl. Something repetitive was lack of training and education, not only for officials, but also among civilians. Something that was brought up pretty frequently was snakes. There are no poisonous venomous snakes in Jackson, but when a civilian sees it, they're like, oh my God, I have to call animal control. And so just kind of general knowledge about what you should and don't need to fear. And then a lack of adequate finances, just lack of equipment, and then also lack of budgeting from state and federal side. If they can't come do their legal duties. It's put on the municipalities and they have to go outside of their already immense workload. Lack of staff and funds for staffing. Specifically in Jackson, they had a need for more park rangers to prevent illegal hunting and fishing in the parks. And then again, that lack of experience, unnecessarily spent funds due to like misdirection and not knowing how to take care of a certain issue. And then again, that training to, are we taking the right approach to deal with this wildlife concern? And again, lack of employee and citizen knowledge, that fear of wildlife that they don't really know about. And this one was interesting to us, but also a little sad, just higher priorities in general, because being such a busy municipality with such low staffing, wildlife issues just tend to fall at the bottom of the list for them, unfortunately. And so that's something that we want to see. How can we help them move that up the list? So again, the difference based on location, Pearl and Ridgeland are suburban areas. So a needs assessment there is just more training for not only animal control officers, but the police that assist them when the animal control officer can't be present due to that lack of staffing. And then in Jackson, we have more educational tools to help when to let succession take place on those abandoned homes. And also if they're deciding to reclaim abandoned homes, how do they do that properly without disrupting the wildlife? How do we do that sustainably? We want to provide those tools for them. And then also more things to prevent illegal hunting in parks, such as cameras, things like that. So the commonalities amongst all the groups was more staffing, educational trainings for staff and civilians, then annual briefings on wildlife concerns. A really cool quote that we got from the Jackson group was, the Parks and Rec official was asking, can we have more like semi-annual briefings on wildlife? Like, I want to ask you guys questions, tell you we've got raccoon issues, what do I do? And Extension can provide that to them. So immediate things that we can help with would be updated contact lists specifically for those animal control issues, semi-annual municipal urban wildlife briefings, that Q&A forum, and then long-term more wildlife trainings and extension products for the municipalities in general. Our next steps will be, since we only did 3 of the municipalities in Jackson, we've got some more to do there. Then we're going to move into surveys and focus groups with HOAs and neighborhood associations and just other professionals, animal control, wildlife relocation, and then an urban resident survey. And again, we want to deliver that contact list and the briefings that I mentioned. And also we want to modify our master naturalist program to be more focused towards some municipal staff and online municipal trainings. So thank you all so much. Last of the day, really appreciate you being here again. I also want to thank my co-authors and all the municipal officials that gave us this information. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And it's my email and me with my bees, which is unrelated, but I put it up there.
7 seconds.
I had it up here too. I cheated.
No, that's awesome. And thank you for that program. And with that, let's start with questions. What do you got?
How did you get, your municipalities, your volunteers to come and take the survey?
Yeah. So that was a process and a lot of being ignored and chasing, but kind of just, you know, figuring out who's a municipal official in this department and what's their email. And I'm just going to keep emailing them until they come to my focus group. So that's, there was some of that.
Borderline.
Yeah, but don't repeat that. Professionally persistent, yes.
It's great before you get sent a piece of paper to stop. We also had previous arrangements with them for part of the UN network, so the parks officials knew us from the cameras. We started with them and kind of snowball effect from there. They pointed out the folks that most likely would be helpful in
right.
I used to work for the urban wildlife program in Georgia, and we would always get calls from the fire departments about, you know, needing more information about wildlife, because they were getting calls about dealing with, you know, owls and chimneys and other sorts of things. Did you involve the fire departments at all to try to have that issue, or in this area, are they not really involved in the wildlife side of things?
We did not think to involve them initially, but our very last focus group was Jackson. And when I was going through their transcript, there was a mention of, even if the police can't do it, you know, animal control police, then it's like, okay, fire department, please. So I think it would be cool to involve them in the next focus groups that we do with the remaining municipalities. I think that would be really cool.
Step in for just a second, not to pick on Sam, but could you quickly go, just mention the urban wildlife workshops, the Parks and Wildlife program has done for years?
Yeah, so it's kind of an interesting partnership that we have with municipalities, is we host workshops. They host workshops that municipalities geared towards municipalities that they'll attend, get expert information. All that sort of stuff.
Yeah, that's neat. Thank you. Any other questions?
Thank you, great talk. I love the quality good work. Just a methods question. I'm wondering, were you, so 3 focus groups for one for each of the Jackson and okay. And you had like representatives from the police, animal control category, Parks and Rec.
City planning.
Were you, I'm just so curious to know, like, did you feel, or did you see, do you feel like the responses from people from those different groups, like, how did they, like, just behaviorally, like, how do you think people responded, like, being in the same group as others, like a police officer being in some recognition?
Right. Yeah. Well, actually, so one of the municipalities that refused to work with us has a lot of issues with each other. So I guess I'm not all the way answering your question yet, but that was like we don't want to talk to you. We don't want to be in a room together. So that was crazy. Yeah, they said, just send us a survey. Don't contact us again. But other than that, we had a lot of people who have been working with each other for a long time. And specifically in Ridgeland, there was like a lot of just kind of general happiness of being together and people who had worked together for some time. But there was also kind of like a stark difference with, because in Jackson, all we had was Parks and Rec, the official, and we had his assistant, and then we had city planning. And it didn't seem like there was a lot of overlap between those 2 departments. So there wasn't any animosity, but it was kind of just a difference in the content of the responses. Really, it was like we were getting such different things from her on this side of the table, such different things from him on this side of the table. But yeah, but it was no, like I said, no like ill will or anything, it was just a lot of no overlap in a way. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
It's really good to have those folks.
Definitely. It was interesting for sure.
I would follow up to that. We didn't clearly mention it, but we also excluded the elected officials for what I think you're kind of asking, to make sure there wasn't too much of a power dynamic in the room. And then we tried to, by using the flip charts, just the social power dynamic of someone that's a little more quiet, or I mean, the biggest dynamic was the director and the assistant. She was more quieter, but she contributed via the flip charts. We try to counteract that, but we did eliminate that part for that power dynamic.
Yeah.
To try to reduce it as much as possible.
Definitely.
Well, y'all can keep asking questions, but you are officially a minute over, and I know you said you gotta get a plane.
I do.
Yeah. Everyone, thank you so much for coming out for the Human Dimensions sessions. Hope to see everybody in 2 more years. Yeah.
Okay, let's get a picture. Let's get a picture in front of your garage. Yeah, your phone. My phone died when I got your last picture. Here. Thank you. That's right, that's.
Thanks so much.
Sure, sure, sure.
Me too.
It's so good.
Thank you.
It's so good. And it's one of your students?
Yes. Got it, Michigan State now.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Tell me about the bee stuff, all the bee stuff, and it's so exciting. It's so.
Yes, you got a new love, she moved on.
That's okay. A really good study. This was a really interesting study. I wanted to ask him one of my unpleasant questions, but the reception of the municipalities to the state agencies. Is there a relationship? Is that?
There is,
Honestly, the camera project helped us establish.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, well, in the Pearl discussion, it particularly came up that there was some frustration on. One, just trying to know who to contact for what species.
Sure.
There's a specific event that happened with. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
This wouldn't happen.
we don't have. Dispatch with a personal firearms trying to get my dog. But, so it's,
Okay.
so yeah, so that was a specific example, and that's something we're gonna try and work on, and try and find those relationships.
Very curious. So I'm in Dallas before.
We don't have an urban program at our agency. so
That's gotta change.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
gotta
I know,
change.
well,
Gotta
basically, I'm
change.
basically.
I know. That's what you're doing. That's what you're
Well,
actually
so I
doing.
have the legal authority that they would need.
So just by title, but yeah, I mean, with the municipalities, yeah. Just kind of kick the can down and say, hey, all we're doing. is-
Yeah, that's really what they were asking for.
And they don't have the training for the time.
Right. And the ACO is really concerned if she gets called out. for- Yeah. The mayor's gonna blow up. But it's beyond my, authority. I ain't taking a personal risk.
This was a great, I know that y'all are in the.
Yeah.
But a great.
Thank you so much.
And we'll be in touch.
Yes, definitely. I'm looking forward to.
Awesome. You're there?
Yeah. Ready to run.
Not right, it's that was sort of hard to understand. What did they have to leave? So they would draw. There are a lot of them are here for hunting purposes, but they were originally. And you had since like 1400 by the defense. Make sure they got a food source. It wasn't the one. It was some holiday was domesticated that was. Yeah. So what happened, and talking about 1954 is kind of a magic mark in the United States. 1954, 1955 is when the US officially started transitioning from being most of the population living in the city. And so during the years, and all the families, you know, back in the early 19s, you have to remember the leaders, all they did was it's a lot of NCs. And people would just, they would knock the ears on any, each family would have their own ear notching. And then something go. And then, yeah. Yeah. Now, do you think they, because do you think they burned up all of them all the time? No. So, because that's where we ended up getting, when they were working on the stores, the Catanula. So now. Yeah, they were set up so that. When they needed. Sell it more, they start rounding up. Otherwise, they just let them. And they didn't really advance to 19, I think it's in the 1990s. That's when and that's what we said, like, yeah, I think. Yes, they were trapped in one place and no one. I wouldn't the law enough. But it takes. I can say, most things. think the areas we're out from, like Kansas, Kansas, because they don't want to intentionally incentivize them. They don't have very many agendas. They don't want to, they maybe leave it attention, so there's no incentive. So this is the balance and put it.